What distinguishes Broadcasting Scotland from a website or blog, apart from our brilliant programmes?
Hi there, I'm Gordon Ross.
Are the costs we face to enable us to produce those programmes. These costs are significant and ongoing. However, our facilities are able to do so much more if only we had the staff. In the last year, some of our supporters have cancelled their subscriptions. In one way, we would prefer it if it was because they didn't like us, rather than it being because of the financial pressures which we are all under because of COVID. The really positive outcome of our fundraiser is that at a time of economic challenge in Scotland, we will use your donations to create jobs and in a small way contribute to improving the Scottish economy. If you want us to be Scotland's independent broadcaster, able to provide an alternative mainstream television platform, then please support us.
Scotland is going to be an independent country.
Just imagine what we could do if we had even 1% of the BBC Scotland channel's budget. Imagine. And then please consider turning your imagination into reality. Please support us if you can afford it.
Good afternoon. Can I remind members of the COVID-related measures in place and that face masks should be worn while moving around the chamber and around the Holyrood campus. The next item of business is portfolio questions, and the portfolio is rural affairs and islands. As ever, if a member wishes to ask a supplementary question, could they please press the request to speak buttons or place an R in the chat function during the relevant question. And I call on question number 1, Sharon Dowey.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what discussions the Rural Affairs Secretary has had with ministerial colleagues regarding cross-government action to improve connectivity for Scotland's island communities.
Cabinet Secretary.
As Cabinet Secretary for Rural Affairs and Islands, it's my responsibility to ensure cross-government coordination on islands, and that involves regularly meeting with ministerial colleagues across all portfolios, including the Minister for Transport. Work continues across both the Rural Affairs and Islands and Transport portfolios at ministerial and official level to ensure that a coordinated response to the challenges that arise for our island communities.
Sharon Dowey.
Thank you for that answer. Services, tourism and cultural events are essential to islanders, but their local economy is being put at risk by failing ferries. The message from ferry bodies and the Scottish Government is now that islanders' expertise shouldn't even be represented in CalMac's and CMAL's boards. Why is this Central Belt-focused SNP Government ignoring islanders, and what action will they take to make sure islanders' voices are heard?
Cabinet Secretary.
I mean, I refute that claim straight off as well. This isn't a central belt government. I represent a rural constituency, as do a number of my colleagues as well. And that's absolutely at the heart of the work that I do as Cabinet Secretary for Rural Affairs. Now, in relation to the point that the member has raised, we're absolutely committed to ensuring that island residents and communities' views are represented appropriately. And we've asked the new chair as a priority to consider how that might be achieved. And residents of island communities are free to apply to become members of the DML board if they wish, and we advertised the recent chair and 3 non-executive director positions widely, including on the vessels travelling to our island communities. And members were appointed based on their abilities and the understanding of the role of transport, including ferries, in maintaining the economic and social integrity of the Highlands and Islands, and that's a requirement for all board members.
A supplementary, Jenny Minto.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Transport links are integral to rural disparate communities. The island of Jura in my constituency has had a 40% population increase in the last 10 years. However, their transport links need some improvement. Can the Cabinet Secretary outline what plans the Scottish Government has to engage with island residents regarding their connectivity needs as it progresses its commitment to deliver the island's connectivity plan and ensure our island communities flourish?
Cabinet Secretary.
Now, while responsibility for ferries actually lies with the Minister for Transport, Graham Day, as Cabinet Secretary for Rural Affairs and Islands, I absolutely understand the interdependency of transport and the wider challenges of island community sustainability. And that's a message that I was happy to convey in recent engagement that I had with the Ferries Community Board. And I remain absolutely committed to ensuring that the Scottish Government will continue to engage on population challenges, including island connectivity needs, through developing positive policies that we've talked about previously in the Chamber, such as Islands Bonds, the Carbon Neutral Islands and the Islands Connectivity Plan. And the Islands Connectivity Plan, which is going to replace the current ferries plan from January in 2023, will include a long-term investment programme for new ferries and development at ports with the aim to improve resilience, reliability, capacity and accessibility to meet the needs of our island communities.
Thank you. Question number 2, Bill Kidd.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what assessment it has made of the implications for the fishing sector in Scotland of the outcomes of the sea fisheries negotiations.
Cabinet Secretary.
Our aim across all negotiations is to find a balanced and sustainable outcome for the Scottish fishing industry, supporting the sector today as well as ensuring its future. Now, I'm pleased to say that the coastal states consultations have successfully concluded and we've reached agreement on 2022 catch limits for mackerel, blue whiting and Atlanto-Scandian herring and a work plan to continue sharing discussions in early 2022. And we estimate the value of this deal for Scotland to be worth around £186 million through 2022. Now, the bilateral talks are ongoing, and while we don't yet have the final outcomes, I can assure the Chamber that we're engaging constructively with our international fishing partners to get the best possible outcome for Scotland. And I'll notify Parliament of the outcome of all the negotiations when they're complete.
Bill Kidd.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that response. Can the Cabinet Secretary confirm the change to tonnage in fish exports from Scotland and whether this reflects the promises of improvements made by proponents of Brexit, perchance?
Cabinet Secretary.
Now, we do have the data that's been obtained from HMRC, and that shows for the first 2 quarters of this year, the fish exported to the EU from Scotland was just over 68,000 tonnes, which is a 13.5% decrease from the same period in 2019. And I think that just goes to show the clear evidence of the disastrous impact on the Scottish seafood sector, who relied heavily on the EU for trade. Now, over 70% of Scottish seafood exports were to the EU in 2019, and that was worth over £770 million. The Scottish Salmon Producers Organisation reported losses of at least £11 million in January alone as a direct result of the changes that were brought about by Brexit. And additionally, the organisation estimates that businesses are spending around £200,000 a month due to extra paperwork. The loss in trade to the seafood sector since early January this year, I think, offers the clearest evidence that we've seen so far of the additional costs and impacted association with becoming an EU third country and the trade frictions that that's introduced.
Supplementary, Jamie Halker-Johnson.
Thank you. The Cabinet Secretary will want to ensure that new offshore wind developments do not interrupt established fishing operations. However, the Shetland Fishermen's Association earlier this week highlighted a number of concerns around data used, noting a lack of reflection for movements of non-Scottish vessels or consideration of issues caused to fishermen outside of bottom trawling. So will the Cabinet Secretary look into these concerns and, if required, take action to support the industry when developments are being considered?
Cabinet Secretary.
I would just want to assure the member that we do have regular engagement, both myself and my officials, with the industry. But if there are particular concerns there that they wish to discuss with me, then I'm more than happy to look into that.
Question number 3, Murdo Fraser.
Thank you. To ask the Scottish Government what compensation will be made available to farmers who have been impacted by beaver activities.
Minister Lorna Slater.
The reintroduction of beavers represents a step forward in restoring Scotland's biodiversity. We want to ensure that more of Scotland benefits from the biodiversity enhancements brought by beavers. Nature Scot will continue to support land and fisheries managers experiencing negative beaver impacts through providing free advice and help with practical management through the Scottish Beaver Mitigation Scheme. We want to work with land managers to find ways of coexisting with beaver populations, developing support mechanisms for land managers who are delivering positive biodiversity outcomes will be more productive in the longer term than compensation based on negative impacts.
Murdo Fraser.
Can I thank the Minister for that response? The Government's recent decision to allow the expansion of the beaver population into new parts of Scotland has been welcomed by some, but many farmers are already suffering significant financial loss due to beaver damage, for example, to flood banks or cutting down trees, and as a result they've lost crops. Hearing that they're going to be offered free advice is going to be of very little comfort to them when they're facing significant financial loss. So can I ask again, what new financial assistance will be made available to farmers who are suffering as a result of this decision made by the Scottish Government?
Minister.
Thank you. The Nature Scott Beaver Mitigation Scheme is now in place and can offer land managers advice and practical assistance with mitigating the impacts of beavers, including taking proactive measures to prevent impacts where these are appropriate. This includes the protection of high-value trees, heritage trees, landscape trees and amenity trees, the installation of flow devices in beaver dams and, where appropriate, beaver exclusion fencing. Nature Scott will continue to work with stakeholders in developing the mitigation scheme and with new and innovative approaches. Licensing approaches are available to prevent serious damage where mitigation cannot resolve the conflict.
Supplementary first, Ariane Burgess.
Thank you. As Scottish Environment Link's beaver champion, I am delighted that beavers will now be allowed to expand across the country. It means that many more people can benefit from the ecological benefits they bring as ecosystem engineers, as well as the sheer joy of once again sharing our natural environment with these charismatic animals. I'm sure that there are many land managers who would benefit from and welcome beavers on their land. Can the Minister advise what they need to do to receive a translocated beaver family?
Minister.
I thank the member very much for her question and for her work as Scottish Environment Link's beaver champion. There are many people in Scotland who would love to have beavers on their land if they have the appropriate environment for them, and any land managers interested in having translocated beavers on their land should contact Nature Scott through the email and phone contact details on their webpage, beavers@nature.scot or 01463 725 364. Nature Scott will discuss the different aspects of translocating beavers to their site, and this includes scoping site suitability, carrying out effective public engagement and consultation, the practical aspects of trapping and transportation, captive holding whilst animals are being health screened, and some level of post-release monitoring.
Further supplementary, Jim Fairley.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And there is no doubt that I have to agree that there are definitely farmers not far from our constituency, Mr Fraser, who have actually looked to get beavers translocated to their land. However, I accept they make an important contribution to restoring Scotland's natural environment, but their modifications to the environment can in some places produce negative impacts on agricultural land. Can the Cabinet Secretary provide any further information as to what the support from the Scottish Government will be, in particular to the fences that you just alluded to a minute ago, to help negate the negative impacts of beavers being introduced?
Minister. Absolutely. I thank the member for the question. The member is quite correct that the reintroduction of beavers demonstrates our commitment to protect and enhance biodiversity. Beavers have a really positive impact on biodiversity, creating new wetland habitat for a range of important species. They also help reduce flood risk by slowing down flows and improving water quality by filtering out sediments. The Nature Scott Beaver Mitigation Scheme is in place and can offer land managers practical assistance in mitigating the impacts, such as what I've listed already, protecting high-value trees, installation of flow devices and, where appropriate, beaver exclusion fencing. Nature Scott will continue to work with stakeholders in developing these mitigation schemes and making sure that landowners and land managers can live alongside beavers.
Thank you. Questions number 4 and 5 were not lodged, so question number 6, Sandesh Golhani.
Thank you. To ask the Scottish Government whether it will provide an update on its work outlined in the programme for government to determine how best to support new and young entrants into farming.
Cabinet Secretary.
We are continuing to work on options which will best add to the existing support provided by our Farming Opportunities for New Entrants Group, the Scottish Land Matching Service, Farm Advisory Service and direct payments. And our aim remains that the outcome will be announced soon.
Sandesh Golhani.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. Despite the SNP throwing taxpayer money and encouraging young women to join agricultural industry, the Young Farmers Start-up Grant Scheme only handed out funding to 62 women across Scotland over 4 years. In 2019, there was only one successful applicant, just one. Young farmers deserve better than this, especially young women in rural areas. Does the Cabinet Secretary believe that a single successful applicant in 1 year is an acceptable return of investment? And Will she outline exactly what measures she is taking to improve on this abysmal record?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I would just say that we are absolutely committed to ensuring that we see more new entrants into farming. I was just visiting an opportunity this week through the Farming Opportunities for New Entrants, where we've been looking at the opportunities that can be offered through public land to encourage new entrants as well. But in terms of getting more women and more diversity into agriculture, absolutely. Can we do more? I agree with that too. And that's why we made specific commitments in our manifesto in relation to getting more women into agriculture. And to really make Scottish agriculture more inclusive. So, because women living and working in Scottish agriculture are an absolutely essential part of the future of the rural economy, and developing and expanding their skills really will ensure the long-term sustainability of the agricultural sector. Now, we've committed £300,000 this financial year to bring about practical solutions to support women. That includes the wider rollout of Be Your Best Self, personal development training, a pilot of agricultural business skills training, and a project to test innovative solutions for childcare in rural areas, and the development of Skills Seeder, which is a skills sharing app to encourage greater participation in rural and land-based learning. And during the course of this Parliament, we will double the funding to support women in agriculture of up to £600,000.
Question number 7, Marie McNair.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what measures have been put in place to protect livestock against avian flu. Cabinet Secretary.
The Chief Veterinary Officer for Scotland confirmed a second outbreak of highly pathogenic avian influenza H5N1 at a premises near Gretna in Dumfries and Galloway on the 3rd of December. And as with the earlier case in Angus, protection and surveillance zones were immediately established around the infected premises, which puts in place a range of mandatory disease control measures, such as restrictions on the movement of poultry, domestic mammals, carcasses, eggs and other poultry products. Now, in response to an increased risk of spread of disease from migratory birds, Scottish ministers introduced a national avian influenza prevention zone on the 3rd of November, and these measures were enhanced on the 29th of November, requiring housing of all poultry and captive birds, and for keepers to apply further robust biosecurity measures, which are key to preventing the spread of disease. Advice from Public Health and from epidemiologists is that this strain of highly pathogenic avian influenza represents a very low risk to human health and to other mammals, and investigations as to the source of the infection and links with the current infected premises and livestock is an element of the wider epidemiological investigation process to really ensure that the disease is stamped out as quickly as possible.
Marie McNair.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that answer. With COVID-19 impacting businesses in various ways, what supports are in place for bird keepers if the worst should happen to their livestock?
Cabinet Secretary.
Compensation is paid for birds that have to be culled as part of our disease response in line with valuation tables, and these are updated regularly by the Animal and Plant Health Agency on behalf of the Scottish Government. And the Scottish Government don't compensate for any dead or visibly ill birds, which is in line with the policy elsewhere in the UK. Now, if a larger poultry or captive bird business is in a disease control zone, there might be trade issues that are associated with regionalisation, and the Scottish Government work with the DEFRA market access and veterinary trade facilitation teams who liaise with poultry industry stakeholders and the APHA Centre for International Trade to really try and understand and address the issues and priorities for poultry exports. DEFRA Market Access also liaise with British Embassy colleagues globally to answer trade-related queries from central competent authorities and provide updates to third-country trading partners and really seek clarity on the terms of trade where that's required. The Scottish Government will liaise with the National Farmers Union Scotland and the British Egg Industry Council to support those affected businesses where that's required. But I would emphasise again that it's a good biosecurity that's extremely important for keepers to practice in order to reduce the risk of their birds being infected by a notifiable avian disease.
Question number 8, Colin Smith.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what action it's taken to support the agriculture and fisheries sectors to play a leading role in delivering a net zero Scotland.
Cabinet Secretary.
The Scottish Government is committed to driving action to support all sectors to transition to net zero and ensuring that that transition is a just one. It's clear that agriculture and fisheries have to play a leading role in that. Now, policies and programmes such as the Blue Economy Vision, the Future Fisheries Management Strategy and the Agriculture Reform Implementation Oversight Board, as well as practical measures like the Marine Fund Scotland and the National Test Programme, are enabling conversations and supporting innovation, as well as helping farmers and fishers understand how their work impacts on climate and nature and what they can do to deliver that change.
Colin Smith.
Thank you, President Officer. Now, given that the Greens an SNP partnership agreement has got nothing to say about ending overfishing, it's got nothing to say about ending the wasteful practice of discarding, and it's got nothing to say about landing a bigger share of the catch closer to home in Scottish ports. Does the Cabinet Secretary think that's consistent with securing sustainability and environmental recovery for our inshore seas and fisheries?
Cabinet Secretary.
The cooperation agreement that we have with the Scottish Green Party is highly ambitious in a lot of areas and really looking to protect our marine environment. And just because certain specific elements aren't listed within that, that doesn't mean that they're, of course, not important. Now, I would also outline the measures that we have that we've already set out as part of our future fisheries management strategy about how we intend to take the steps to make sure that our marine environment is a healthy one and that we continue to fish in a sustainable way.
A few supplementaries. Firstly, Beatrice Wishart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. There are plans to locate offshore wind farms and rich fishing grounds west of Shetland to provide electricity for oil and gas installations. Shetland Fishermen's Association has highlighted flaws in the offshore wind farm consultation process, as Jamie Halcrow-Johnson's already alluded to earlier. Can the Scottish Government commit to gathering and fully assessing data on all fishing activity from these areas and listen to local fishermen's concerns?
Cabinet Secretary.
I would just emphasise and reiterate what I'd stated in my previous response to Jamie Halcrow-Johnson. You know, I am the Fisheries Minister, and it's critical for me that I listen to the concerns that are voiced, and I'm more than happy to engage on that and to listen to the Shetland Fishermen's Association concerns directly.
And Rachel Hamilton.
Thank you. In light of our climate emergency and the urgent need to give farmers, communities and landowners clarity over net zero, will the Scottish Government join Scottish Conservative calls backed by the Woodland Trust Scotland to simplify and make changes to grant schemes for riparian planting now, rather than waiting until 2024, when it might just be too late to save iconic species such as salmon?
Cabinet Secretary.
There's a number of pieces that are obviously ongoing in relation to protecting our iconic species, as Rachel Hamilton mentions, and I'd be more than happy to contact her about the suggestion that she has there about riparian tree planting and how that will be considered in future.
And Marie McNair.
Thanks, President Officer. Can the Minister provide any further details as to steps which are being taken to reduce ammonia emissions in the agricultural sector?
Okay, Cabinet Secretary.
Now, just in response to the member, we've updated the regulations that govern controls on the storage and application of slurry and digestate by introducing the legislative requirement to use low-emission precision spreading equipment. We can reduce the ammonia emissions from agriculture by up to 70%, which ultimately protects our vital water environment and reduces the agricultural impact on climate change. Now, this will also make an important contribution to the commitments on reducing air pollutant emissions from agricultural activity, which are set out in our new air quality strategy, which was published earlier this year. And through the National Test Programme, which I announced at the end of October, we'll also be providing support for nutrient management plans, supporting more efficient fertiliser use and so reduced ammonia emissions.
Thank you very much indeed, Cabinet Secretary. That concludes portfolio questions. There'll be a slight pause while the front bench is changed and we move on to the next item of business. Okay, and the next item of business is a statement by Jenny Ruth on supporting culture in Scotland. The Minister will take questions on the issues raised in her statement, so there should be no interventions or interruptions, and I call on the Minister for around 10 minutes.
Presiding Officer, we will shortly hear from the Finance Secretary on the Scottish Government's budget for the coming financial year. Supporting our economic recovery is, of course, absolutely vital to our continued navigation out of the COVID pandemic. But there can be no economic recovery without our cultural sector. Many of us will recall at the end of the second lockdown how it felt to experience culture again. There were emotional scenes as people returned to our museums and galleries and as musicians and actors returned to the stage. Supporting Scotland's culture sector to recover and ensuring that access to culture is equitable has never been more important. The culture sector was one of the worst impacted parts of our society by the pandemic restrictions. Following the initial lockdown in May of 2020, GDP for the arts, culture and recreation sector decreased by 56% below pre-pandemic levels. Indeed, the sector has still not fully recovered, with the latest statistics for September of this year showing that GDP for the sector was 12% lower than pre-pandemic levels, compared to just 1% lower for the economy overall. Our museums closed, our theatres shut, live music could no longer be experienced. And yet, the pandemic has also shown the incredible ingenuity of Scotland's culture sector. That resilience has been the overarching theme of my meetings with the sector since May. Whether through digitising content or the ventilation of premises, the sector kept going. Our support to digitise content included the Creative Digital Initiative, supported by £1 million of Scottish Government funding. This funding supported creative and cultural businesses to enhance creative opportunities as they responded to COVID-19. Nonetheless, there remain challenges for the sector as it continues to re-emerge from the pandemic. Since the start of the pandemic, the Scottish Government has provided more than £175 million of emergency funding to the culture sector, far in excess of the £97 million of consequentials that we received from the UK Government. And I know that providing this support has been a real lifeline to our freelancers, to our venues and organisations. It's allowed libraries to reopen, it's supported artists to keep working, it's enabled community cultural activities to continue, and it's also helped to protect children's well-being through creative learning. However, the withholding of funding by the UK Government is placing Scottish artists and cultural organisations at a significant disadvantage compared with their counterparts elsewhere in the UK. The UK Government has recently made further announcements on the allocations in England from £300 million of the cultural recovery funding announced in the March budget. Scotland's culture sector, meanwhile, still awaits its full share of Barnett consequentials. As the Omicron variant continues to make its way through our population, I know there is a real sense of anxiety in the culture sector. The pandemic has also presented challenges in the form of human behaviour, which naturally has adapted in light of the restrictions. Audience confidence has been affected. Indeed, as the Events Industry and Advisory Group told me recently, the current percentages for no-shows are far higher than pre-pandemic, up to 40% in some instances at events. The Scottish Government's Business Ventilation Fund, which launched last month, provides some assistance in this space, allowing audiences to feel safer as they return to live events. The COVID vaccination certification scheme has also given event organisers in Scotland a level of certainty since its introduction. It's certainly welcome that the UK Government is now following suit. The scheme has allowed events to continue, and it has further encouraged and supported audience confidence. The impacts of the pandemic have additionally been magnified, though, by those created following the Brexit deal negotiated by the UK Government last year. Indeed, the end of free movement and the loss of key EU programmes such as Creative Europe has only exacerbated the challenges initiated by COVID. The Trade and Cooperation Agreement does not contain visa-free mobility arrangements, meaning creative professionals now have to navigate differing visa requirements and exemptions with significant increased costs and red tape. The Scottish Government has funded Arts Info Point, which is a pilot mobility scheme which helps provide advice on visa applications, tax and social security. But there is, of course, a limit on what we can do in this space. And I raised this matter on 2 occasions with the former Culture Minister in the UK Government, and I know that the other devolved governments have done likewise. But the obvious solution is that the UK Government negotiates a visa waiver agreement to allow for visa-free touring for musicians. Presiding Officer, in June of this year, further funding of £25 million was announced to support further rounds of the Culture Organisations and Venues Recovery Fund and the Performing Arts Venues Relief Fund. This included £700,000 for the Tron Theatre in Glasgow, £238,000 for the Beacon Arts Centre in Inverclyde and £1.25 million for Aberdeen Performing Arts. The support Government had to bluntly get out the door back in May was absolutely crucial. I know that it prevented many organisations from going to the wall. But the support that Government must now provide needs to better reflect our new landscape. Yesterday, the Cabinet Secretary announced funding for the Kelvin Hall in Glasgow, where we've invested £7.9 million in a £12 million project. That significant investment in the screen sector is helping Scotland to seize opportunities and build sustainable Scottish-based film and television businesses. But it's not only about creating state-of-the-art facilities, it's also about developing and retaining new skills and talent here in Scotland, so we can make even more high-quality productions right here in Scotland. I'm also really pleased to announce today that further spend to support the culture sector's recovery will be spent on 3 distinct areas. First of all, over £4 million of the remaining culture consequentials will be provided to support our innovative Culture Collective programme. For example, Stellar Quines is creating 4 creative hubs across Fife to deliver Young Quines, which is a free-to-access youth theatre activity for young women. This additional funding will support the Creative Communities Network to build its capacity and extend into new communities, but it also will continue to embed on the links developed during the programme's first year. This funding recognises the need to provide direct support to our communities, and it reinforces the central vision of our culture strategy, that culture is for everyone. On that note, I was really pleased to meet with the Culture Conveners Group earlier this week to hear directly of the challenges and opportunities of investing in culture in our communities can bring, and I hope this funding will be welcomed by COSLA, and I look forward to working with the Culture Conveners Group to further ensure that recovery is rooted in community accessibility. The second amount of funding relates to museums and galleries sector and developing their resilience. So there will be now a £1 million fund available to support that work. And I know that, in particular, for many smaller organisations, these investments can make a real difference. This funding is going to help with equipment and adaptations that help respond to the pandemic, and it will also restart activity as our cultural venues continue to welcome back audiences and visitors. Finally, Presiding Officer, I will provide £1 million of capital funding this year to support the re-establishment of the Scottish Crannog Centre in Kenmore as part of an overall package of £2.3 million for the centre to relocate to a new site following the terrible fire at the centre back in May. The Crannog is a very special place, which is not just a site of significant archaeological interest. It's also a community, it's an educational outreach base, and it's part of the cultural landscape that tells the story of this country. I don't think I'll ever forget being able to hold a piece of fabric which dates from the Iron Age when I visited earlier this year. I know that the fire caused not only devastation to the site itself, but significant emotional distress to employees and local people alike. I hope that this funding goes some way to assuring the impassioned Director Mike Benson and to all at the Crannog community that the Scottish Government recognises and values the special role that the centre holds in Scotland's cultural heritage. Despite the devastating impact of the pandemic, culture, creativity and heritage indeed played a vital role in people's lives during lockdown. When none of us could leave our homes, we could at least still experience culture. Whether listening to music or reading a book, the well-being impacts associated with culture cannot be underplayed in our recovery from the pandemic. On that note, I want to mention just a few of the many examples of where, with government support, cultural organisations have harnessed the power of creativity to address social isolation and mental health during the pandemic. The National Theatre of Scotland has been tackling social isolation by supporting the cultural and social rights of the LGBTI+ over 50s group and have run a programme aimed at tackling anxiety in teenagers. Scottish Ballet have delivered dance programmes tackling mental health and wellbeing for healthcare staff and primary and secondary school pupils. The National Museums of Scotland provided tailored programming to those living with dementia, and our support for the Arts Alive programme, run by the Scottish Book Trust and Systema Scotland's Big Noise programme, has been making a difference to the confidence, resilience and happiness of thousands of school children across Scotland. Additionally, our national performing companies moved quickly to pivot to their virtual audiences, including the National Theatre of Scotland, who recently launched their digital education platform. This is an online resource bank for secondary school teachers and students, offering free digital access to NTS productions and resources, ensuring that every young person can now experience an NTS production. Presiding Officer, supporting the recovery of the cultural sector from the pandemic is not just a job for me nor the Cabinet Secretary, because culture impacts and intersects with every part of government responsibility. Last month, a Cabinet paper was agreed to which sets out the next steps on how we plan to drive that recovery. In education, health, economic development and on net zero, culture has a key role to play in our recovery, and investing in culture can help in delivering wider wellbeing outcomes as we move towards a wellbeing economy. I look forward to working with ministerial colleagues as we bring those plans forward. Culture, as I mentioned, helped many of us through the pandemic, reading books, listening to music and even watching the television. But now it's the time to ensure that government helps culture by delivering a sustainable recovery for all. As Volkan Bozkir, who is the President of the UN General Assembly, has observed, as we look to recover from COVID-19, we must simultaneously draw upon the skills of those in the creative sphere and ensure that no artist or cultural profession is left behind. From our festivals to our libraries, from our theatres to our castles, this government is absolutely committed to delivering an equitable cultural recovery for the benefit of the people of Scotland. Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much, Minister. The Minister will now take questions on the issues raised in her statement. I intend to allow around 20 minutes for questions, after which we'll need to move to the next item of business, and it would be helpful as ever if members who wish to ask a question could press the request to speak buttons now or as soon as possible. And I call on Sharon Dowey.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I thank the Minister for advance sight of her statement? The pandemic has clearly had an impact across our economy, and it is clear that it is our cultural sector that has perhaps faced some of the greatest hardship. Theatres unable to open, artists and musicians unable to perform, and in every part of Scotland, the curtain has come down on too many local venues. The Scottish Conservatives acknowledge the additional funding for the sector announced today. Frankly, it's a sector that needs all the help it can get, but it's not just the funding that is needed to support the arts through this phase of the pandemic. It is practical advice and support too. Productions are being forced to change or close at the last minute, and for many smaller companies across the country, this can be a real issue. While new funding is welcome, we know that cultural organisations have reported that it sometimes takes too long for funding to reach them when it's needed. Having met with various groups, the application process for Creative Scotland proves hard to navigate. What can the Scottish Government do to streamline the process and protect those companies who could go to the wall if funding is not delivered quickly enough?
Minister.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I thank Sharon Dowey for that question. She raises a number of important issues. First of all, with regard to the economic impact, which I touched upon in my opening statement, I think we need to be cognizant that the economics of where we are as a country have really impacted on the cultural sector in ways that they haven't in other parts of our society, which were able to reopen fully, even at the start of this year. And if you think back to May of this year after the election, theatres, for example, were still in a level of lockdown. There were still restrictions around about social distancing, for example, which impacted the number of people that theatres, of course, could accommodate. So there was a real challenge there in May. I don't think the same challenge exists now. The challenge is different, but we need to very much be live to the risks, of course, that new variants present to the sector. And I'm very, very conscious of that in my dealings with them on a regular basis. Sharon Dowey mentioned, I think, practical advice and support to organisations. Primarily funding, as she will know, is administered via Creative Scotland and not directly from government itself. So if there is an issue around about funding not getting to those organisations quickly, I'd be keen to raise it with them. And in fact, I'm meeting Creative Scotland tomorrow, so I will raise it with them on Sharon Dowey's behalf. I think it's hugely important. We did have an issue back in May around about accessing funding and ensuring it could be delivered quickly, and we managed to resolve that. But I recognise some of the challenges she speaks to. On engagement more broadly, I spend a lot of my time as Minister speaking to the events industry and advisory group that I mentioned, who are not shy in telling me where the challenges are at this moment in time with regard to our recovery from the pandemic. So I suppose a note of reassurance to Sharon Dowey that engagement very much continues. And as we are facing an increasingly challenging time in terms of the pandemic and the changing nature of the virus, it's really vital that engagement continues. So if there are organisations that Sharon Dowey knows about that she would like to make me aware of, or if they feel as though they would like direct engagement with government, I'm more than happy to give my time to them, because I recognise the challenge and the need for ongoing support and that practical advice that she spoke to in her question.
Thank you. And Sarah Boyack.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I also thank the Minister for advance sight of her statement and agree with the importance of funding to support our cultural sector, our venues and those who work in the sector. But will the Minister acknowledge the huge impact on cultural venues and organisations of the requirement to draw down their reserves before they qualified for Scottish Government funding during the pandemic? Because those organisations are now under massive pressure, given the length of time, as she's acknowledged, they weren't able to operate, and the very, very long financial shadow that COVID has created over their capacity to recover to get back to where they were pre-COVID. So what financial support can she offer them today? Can I also agree that culture is absolutely critical to our collective well-being? So will the Minister commit to offering the same support and recognition which she's offered to Arts, Culture and Wellbeing Scotland to develop, to the Arts and Education Recovery Group to support those who've worked tirelessly throughout COVID-19 to ensure that young people have access to cultural experiences? And finally, will she consider arts prescribing to help people recover from COVID? We have some great programmes, as you've mentioned, but don't we need everyone to be able to benefit from the arts when they need it mentally, regardless of where they live, to promote our collective health and well-being going forward?
Minister.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I thank Sarah Boyack for her question. There's a number of different issues that she touches upon, so I'll try to summarise those in detail. The first point she makes relates to funding in terms of venues drawing down on their own reserves before they access funding. She will recognise some of the challenges we face as a government at the initial beginning of the pandemic in terms of the financial situation in which we found ourselves, but nonetheless I do take her point. What I would say is that the government support that we've been able to provide, which is over £175 million to the sector to the cultural heritage and events sector, is far in excess, as I mentioned, of the £97 million of consequentials we received from the UK Government. And there is, I think, an outstanding question mark around about those consequentials, which of course have been delivered to cultural organisations in England and not to their equivalent here in Scotland, which is deeply concerning. On the point she raises with regard to additional funding, I have mentioned in my statement today funding commitments which will go to support museum recovery, which will go to support the Crannog and the very unique situation that Crannog found itself in earlier this year. But lastly, on the cultural collective work, which I think is hugely important, a lot of our recovery plans at this moment in time are focused on driving a community recovery with regard to our cultural sector. I think that's vitally important. It has to be rooted in accessibility. We know that our poorer communities are less likely to have access to culture, so therefore it's important that our recovery plans reflect that and challenge that additionally to make sure that funding gets to those who need it most. Ms Boyack also mentioned arts and education with regard to funding, and we will hear, of course, later from the Finance Secretary in terms of the budget, so I don't want to prejudge any announcement that she will make. But in terms of arts prescribing, I'm in general very supportive of that as a method to ensure that cultural recovery. That is what I would talk to as preventative spend, and making those interventions is hugely important. One of the points I touched upon in my statement was the Cabinet paper, which recently went up to Cabinet, I think, a few weeks ago now. And the Cabinet Secretary and I will be meeting with a number of other Cabinet Secretaries, including the Education Secretary, very soon to discuss some of the opportunities here. So I'm very, very keen, of course, as Ms Boyack will know, with my former teacher hat on, that we further explore the opportunity through arts and education. And arts prescribing more generally is certainly a very valid place that I would like to see us explore more in more detail.
Audrey Nicholl, to be followed by Jeremy Balfour.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. As the Minister has already updated, Brexit has undoubtedly thrown up barriers, including the ability of artists to tour and perform. Can the Minister advise what steps the Scottish Government is taking to support Scotland's artists and musicians to tour and perform in Europe?
Minister.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Brexit has undoubtedly created challenges for touring artists, some of which I mentioned in my opening statement. We are yet to see their full impact given COVID-related travel restrictions, but it has introduced costs and administrative barriers to accessing these sectors' largest overseas markets. And as I noted in my statement, we have provided £10,000 to support Arts Info Point, which is a scheme set up to help artists navigate the new administrative challenge that Brexit has created. The Scottish Government will, of course, continue to make the case that the UK Government and EU should agree visa-free travel arrangements to allow UK and EU artists to move freely. I last met with the UK Government Culture Minister in June. I am yet to meet with the new UK Government Culture Minister, although I have made a request to do so. So I think it's hugely important for our music sector that we get movement on this issue. There is a pragmatic solution, and it's time that we had some movement on it to help protect jobs in our music sector.
Jeremy Balfour, to be followed by Michelle Thompson.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. We've seen many cultural venues across Scotland succumb to damage in the last few months after underuse as a result of the pandemic and battling the result of recent storms. What is the Scottish Government going to do to protect some of the most vulnerable buildings and communities across Scotland?
Minister.
I thank Jeremy Balfour for his question. So he spoke to cultural venues. I suppose in terms of the support that's come from Scottish Government, we have already contributed a significant amount of funding through our Cultural Organisations and Venue Recovery Fund, which total £25 million. And I gave some examples to Mr Balfour of that impact. In terms of buildings themselves, there is potentially a challenge here that he is live to that I am not. But if there are specific details he would like to share with me, which potentially relate to the heritage sector, then I'd be more than happy to discuss it with him in more detail. I recognise there are some challenges for the heritage sector at this time in terms of reopening buildings. There is also, bluntly, the challenge of climate change, and I saw that for myself very well illustrated by the Hill House box project that some of you might have seen at the Charles Rennie Mackintosh building in Helensburgh, which is a fantastic example of where Historic Environment Scotland have been able to preserve a hugely significantly important building by encasing it in a metal box, and it's to guard against the impacts of climate change. I'm not sure if that's what Mr Balfour was alluding to in his question, but I'm happy to have a further conversation on him and to share any learning that he might have for government in this space, because I recognise the challenges here.
Thank you. Michelle Thompson to be followed by Faisal Chowdhury.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Escalated to me in my capacity as the convener for the cross-party group for music, the Scottish Commercial Music Industry Task Force wrote recently to the UK Government to highlight their concern that only £9 million of £40 million previously committed to in Barnett Consequentials for Culture had been given to the Scottish Government. Now, she's referred to this issue earlier today, but can the Minister outline what specific discussions she's had with the UK Government in relation to this very concerning situation?
Minister.
I thank Michelle Thompson for her question. The specific discussions I've had with the UK Government on this relate to the two meetings I had with the previous Culture Minister, which would have been in June and May of this year. We are still seeking clarity from HM Treasury on why the £40 million has not yet been passed on in full to us. We are continuing to press the UK Government to deliver the remaining £31 million of consequentials, which relate to the March budget announced by the Chancellor earlier this year. On the wider work that we are undertaking in Scottish Government, I've invited the Scottish Commercial Music Industry Task Force and Music Venue Trust to a roundtable discussion on the 15th of December next week with myself and the Cabinet Secretary to allow us to better understand how the Scottish Government can support the music industry and in its recovery from the pandemic. I'm also aware that the Scottish Commercial Music Industry Task Force have written additionally to the UK Government on this matter.
Thank you. Faisal Chowdhury to be followed by Christine Graham.
I thank the Minister for her advanced sight of her statement. What will be crucial for small and community-based organisations now is more access to funding, with countless still today struggling to recover from the impact of COVID-19. Many are still facing barriers to unlock their full potential, as the small community organisations that are the driving force of our culture sector. And the complexities and delays of the application process prevent them being able to forward plan and be sure of the financial support they desperately needed. Events like Edinburgh, Diwali, Eid celebration organised by small organisations where hundreds, including the Minister herself, have visited, are still struggling as of today. Can I ask how the Government will ensure that small organisations can gain access to crucial funding to recover and won't have to wait until a week before their event starts to learn funding is secured?
Minister.
I thank Faisal Chowdhury for his question, and of course I very much enjoyed my experience at Edinburgh Diwali where he was present, and Ms Boyack as well. It was a fantastic experience and a privilege to be a part of that event a couple of weeks ago now. With regard to the support that we've been able to provide, we do understand in the Scottish Government how deeply impacted the sector has been by the impacts of the pandemic, and Faisal Chowdhury rightly speaks to some of the challenges that smaller organisations have experienced. One of the announcements that I've confirmed today was, of course, the Museums and Galleries Fund, which is a £1 million fund. And that will deliver small amounts of funding to smaller organisations, which I think is hugely important. Next year is, of course, Scotland's Year of Stories, and there's a really vital, important message and, I suppose, a story for our museum sector to tell in this regard, because they tell the stories of our local communities. So if we can get funding to these smaller museums, we can help to share that story in Scotland's community and embed that sense of place additionally. On the specific issue around about hold-ups in terms of the complexities and delays in applications, I have not had any correspondence on this matter, but if Mr Chowdhury wants to write to me directly, I'm keen to raise it. It's the second time I have to say it's been raised today, and I'm meeting Creative Scotland, as I mentioned, tomorrow, so I'm more than happy to take that forward, because what I do not want to have to see happen is that smaller organisations are in some way prohibited from bidding for this funding, or, as Mr Chowdhury has alluded to, are more likely to feel the impacts because they are smaller and therefore less robust in dealing with the financial impacts of the pandemic. So let me take that away, and if Mr Chowdhury wants to write to me on the specifics, I'd be more than happy to speak to him directly on the issues he's raised.
Thank you. Christine Graham to be followed by Mark Ruskell.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Minister, with reference to the economic impact of investment in culture, with £2.5 million in Scottish Government funding, the Great Tapestry of Scotland Centre was built in Galashiels, and that to date, since its opening in late August, 7,000 tickets have been sold despite COVID. Does she therefore agree that the £2.5 million investment was an investment not only in the centre, nor indeed in the regeneration of Galashiels, but an investment in the wider Borders economy?
Minister.
Absolutely. It's really fantastic that the new world-class Great Tapestry of Scotland visitor experience, which has been designed, of course, to support regeneration and wellbeing, has opened in Galashiels in Ms Graham's constituency. The Scottish Government has been a strong supporter of the Great Tapestry of Scotland from its inception, and the creation of the new visitor centre is part of a wider economic and social regeneration across the south of Scotland, as Ms Graham alluded to in her question. Just 3 miles from Abbotsford, the home of Sir Walter Scott, it is incredibly fitting that this is where Scotland's story will begin for many people visiting the area, and its opening is an inspiring moment as we look forward to the celebration of the Year of Stories in 2022. I look forward to being able to visit the Great Tapestry in the new year with Ms Graham.
Mark Ruskell, to be followed by Jenny Minto.
Thank you. Can I thank the Minister for the statement, and in particular the increased funding for the Culture Collective and the Crannog Centre. I think we've all had those incredible experiences. It's an absolute time machine. It'd be great to see it recreated. I think what the statement really underlines is the importance of the creative sector in terms of well-being, regeneration, placemaking, mental health. These are busy creative organisations, but they often spend a lot of time trying to apply for annual funding year after year after year. There's a lot of creative time that's wasted through that funding process. So what hope can the Minister give us that we'll move to a multi-year funding process that can ensure that these organisations have got the certainty to really invest in their communities and deliver all the amazing wellbeing benefits that we're used to them delivering?
Before calling the Minister, could I invite those who are moving into the chamber for the next item of business to please respect the colleagues who are engaged in this statement and asking questions? Minister.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I thank Mark Ruskell for his question. He rightly talks to the hugely important wellbeing impacts that investing in culture can bring. And I think there are wider cross-governmental priorities that investing in culture will allow us to deliver. And I'm really keen to meet with ministerial colleagues on this in the next few weeks with the Cabinet Secretary. Specifically on the issue he raises with regard to funding, this would be a matter for Creative Scotland. But as I have alluded to in 2 answers now, I'm meeting them tomorrow, so I'm more than happy to take this up. I think that issue around about financial certainty is one that's well made. I again, though, would relay the uncertainty that not receiving the full amount of the cultural consequentials that were due to the cultural sector in Scotland has created in the sector is not welcome at this time. And certainly if we could get some clarity from UK Government on this in the immediate future, it would be absolutely welcome. But I'm happy in the interim to raise this matter with Creative Scotland.
Jenny Minto, to be followed by Pam Gosell.
Thanks, Presiding Officer, and I'd like to thank the Minister for her statement, but I'd like to ask the Minister how the Scottish Government will ensure that the history and culture of rural and island areas, especially in Gaelic, will be reflected in its policies.
Minister.
There are a range of Gaelic initiatives in place in areas of low population, such as MG Alba, Storlan. Now, if I don't pronounce this correctly, please correct me. Sapal Mór, I see Kate Forbes sitting beside me, and Seolas. These bodies create employment for young Gaelic speakers and opportunities to use the term, use and learn rather the language. But there's also a network of Gaelic development officers operating throughout island and rural areas to support the Gaelic language. I recall actually in my time in Education Scotland sitting across from some of these development officers at the time. In addition, the Scottish Government is working closely and positively with the local authorities in these areas in early years in education and in arts to support Gaelic, and I'd be happy to provide any further information to the member on this. In addition, we also have a number of manifesto commitments to support Gaelic and Scots, and naturally as these develop we will ensure that rural and island communities are reflected in those plans.
Valiant effort, Minister. Pam Gosell, to be followed by Emma Harper.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Minister what discussions the Scottish Government has had around working together with the cultural sector to ensure as many people as possible are using lateral flow tests before attending these venues, which is not mandated by Government.
Minister. I thank Pam Gosell for her question. The primary way in which that we engage with the sector on this matter has been through the Events Industry and Advisory Group, which meets on, I think, every 3 weeks. I meet with the Events Industry and Advisory Group, and this issue is regularly raised with us. It's hugely important. At the last meeting we had 2 weeks ago now, the issue was raised around a communications package, which we're now working on the events industry about. I think it's hugely important that we keep continuing, particularly with the new emergence of new variants, to relay that messaging to people as they go and experience events. And as we all want to support our cultural recovery, but it's important that the population do that safely. And the main way in which they can do that is, of course, to take a lateral flow test before they attend an event. So that communication with the events industry and advisory group continues, and the communication package that I spoke to, we are working on with officials and the events industry group to make sure that messaging is getting to those who need to hear it, and that people are testing before they go to experience live concerts and events, as particularly important in the run-up to Christmas.
And finally, Emma Harper.
The Minister mentioned Scots. The Scots language is a huge part of Scotland's culture, and promotion of Scots has also been affected by the pandemic. Can the Minister comment on what work the Scottish Government is undertaking to further promote the use of Scots language across Scotland as we emerge through and out of the pandemic? Would the Minister agree to come along to the re-established Scots language cross-party group to attend a future meeting to provide an update on the work in relation to Scots, which I'm told is including Doric as well?
Minister.
I thank Emma Harper for her question. I recognise very much her interest and commitment to the Scots language. The Scottish Government has made it clear that our support for Indigenous languages includes Scots, of course, and it's really essential that those that wish to use the Scots language are given every opportunity to use the language of their choice. For many Scots, it is the language of home and community, and its use in other areas of Scottish life should really be encouraged. Emma Harper has extended an invitation to me to attend her cross-party group, and I'd be more than happy to take up that invitation.
Thank you very much, Minister. That concludes this item of business. There will be a brief pause before we move to the next item of business.
Can I remind members of the COVID-related measures that are in place and that face coverings should be worn when moving around the Chamber and across the Holyrood campus? The next item of business is a statement by Kate Forbes on Scottish Budget 2022 to 2023. The Cabinet Secretary will take questions at the end of her statement, and so there should be no interventions or interruptions. And I call on Kate Forbes, Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Today's budget will help tackle the climate emergency, support economic recovery and reduce inequalities. It comes at a crucial moment for Scotland. It's the first budget of this parliamentary term, and it's also the first budget of this partnership government developed in cooperation with the Scottish Green Party. It delivers on key commitments made in the Butte House Agreement, from free bus travel for young people to doubling the Scottish Child Payment. And as a result of that partnership, this budget redoubles our efforts to meet our emission reduction targets in a fair and just way that creates economic opportunities, harnessing opportunities for green jobs, for prosperity and for greater well-being. PwC and Lloyds Banking Group both conclude that Scotland is the top-ranked part of the UK for green jobs and green economic prosperity. And so the budget supports Scotland at a point of transition, balancing our response to the immediate pressures of COVID and the cost of living crisis with longer-term action. If my last two budgets have been shaped by our immediate experiences of COVID, today's budget aims to lift our eyes to the future, while of course remaining vigilant to the effects of new variants. This is a transitional budget as people, businesses and services get back on their feet. We can't leave anybody behind in our determination to increase prosperity, so the budget directly contributes to our national mission to end child poverty by doubling the Scottish Child Payment and investing in employability schemes to get people back into work.
Presiding Officer, Government can never deliver on all of these ambitions alone, so we need to work collaboratively with all areas of Scottish life, public and private, national and local, to build on the renewed approach to partnership that we saw during the pandemic. However, in the absence of COVID-related funding, despite the very real ongoing impacts of the pandemic and combined with the pressures of inflation, this budget is a budget of choices. And while the budget lays the groundwork for a green economic recovery from COVID-19, we must be clear that the UK Government's spending review hindered rather than helped us on that mission. In practice, with COVID funding having been removed, our day-to-day funding next year is significantly less compared to the current year, at a time when we undeniably need to invest in the economy and help public services recover. That means the budget cannot deliver the resources that all of our partners will want. And let me be clear, there are areas where I would have wished to go further. But today I present a budget which does address key priorities, targets resources for low-income households and paves the way for future investment over the life of this Parliament. It's a budget of choices, but I believe we have made the right choices. It's a transitional budget, maximising funding where we can to deliver key priorities now, but also paving the way for future fiscal choices. Alongside today's Scottish Budget and medium-term financial strategy, I'm publishing a framework for the Resource Spending Review, which will be published in May 2022 and set out the Government's multi-year spending plans. The framework sets out our principles, and I look forward to contributions from members across the Chamber. Presiding Officer, let me now update Parliament on the economic and fiscal context and take a moment first to thank the Scottish Fiscal Commission for the forecasts which inform the budget. Supply chain bottlenecks, labour market shortages, inflationary pressures and rising energy prices are all placing extra pressure on businesses and households trying to recover from the impact of the pandemic. The Fiscal Commission forecasts a level of long-term economic damage to the Scottish economy from COVID-19 of around -2%, similar to the OBR's forecast for the UK economy. This means the long-term impact of Brexit on the economy will be worse than that caused by COVID-19, with the OBR attributing a 4% long-term reduction in living standards due to the UK's exit from the EU. The impact of Brexit has not been felt equally across the UK. Latest figures from the ONS show that Northern Ireland is the only part of the UK where the economy has recovered nearly to pre-pandemic levels. That's not surprising, given that Northern Ireland has, in effect, remained in the EU's single market for goods due to the Northern Irish Protocol. While all other parts of the UK have seen a negative impact as a result of Brexit, the scale of that is 3 times higher in Scotland than in London. We said that Brexit would be bad for Scotland, that it would have a differential impact on our economy, and as is clear, it is, which is having a direct impact on our budget. Be under no illusion, the budget I'm presenting today is smaller than it would have been if it wasn't for the impact of Brexit on our economy, a Brexit that has been imposed on Scotland against the express wish of the people that live here. Brexit and UK Government policy on immigration continues to affect income tax receipts in Scotland. Based on the latest SFC and OBR forecast, Scottish income tax receipts are estimated to be £190 million lower than the BOT grant adjustment next year. There are a number of factors to explain that. Both the SFC and OBR state that the continued uncertainty around the pandemic means that the uncertainty around forecasts may be greater than usual. The final position on the performance of income tax revenues next year will only be known once outturned data is published in 2024. Strong earnings growth in London and the South East, particularly among the highest earners, means that our budget is reduced even while earnings grow in Scotland. That issue is accounted for in the Welsh fiscal framework, but not in ours, and we're clear that it must form part of the upcoming fiscal framework review. rising inequality in England should not see Scotland's budget reduced. But ultimately, without full control over economic policy and immigration, which the UK Government refuses to give us, we don't have full powers to mitigate the effects of Brexit, to secure a green economic recovery from the pandemic, and to raise the revenues that our public services need. Despite all of that, there are reasons for optimism in the Scottish economy. The Fiscal Commission now forecast our economy will recover to pre-pandemic levels by April to June 2022, almost 2 years earlier than forecast at the previous Scottish budget in January. Although they're expecting a peak unemployment rate of 4.9% at the end of this year, that's far below the 7.6% forecast at the time of the previous Scottish budget. And I've taken these forecasts and the overall state of our economy into account when setting tax policies for the year ahead. I'm proud of the consultative approach that we take to taxation in Scotland. We consulted widely in advance of the budget and met with a broad range of stakeholders. We'll maintain our progressive approach, which we will reinforce when we publish Scotland's first framework for tax. And of course, I recognise the ongoing need for stability and certainty for taxpayers at this time, as well as targeted support as a foundation for recovery. For businesses, over the last 2 years, I have delivered 100% rates relief for the retail, hospitality, leisure and aviation sectors. And unlike in England and Wales, we didn't cap the level of support available at any time during that period. We were also the first government to offer the certainty of our relief in 2021-22 when businesses need it the most. On the 1st of July 2021, this year, when retail, hospitality and leisure businesses in England started paying rates, their equivalents in Scotland continued to receive 100% uncapped relief for a further 9 months. Those decisions, along with our unprecedented decision to cut the poundage at the peak of the pandemic, have saved businesses in Scotland around £1.6 billion through the rates system alone since the 1st of April 2020. Recognising that we have offered the most generous rates relief anywhere in the UK for the last 2 years, and the importance of phasing the return of rates liabilities, rates relief for the retail, hospitality and leisure sectors will continue at 50% for the first 3 months of 2022-23, capped at £27,500 per ratepayer. That will prevent a cliff edge for businesses in those sectors. I will also continue to offer the lowest non-domestic rates poundage in the UK at 49.8 pence, delivering a below-inflation uplift for the 4th year in a row, in addition to having the UK's most competitive package of annual reliefs worth £745 million. I have heard the calls to support small businesses in particular and our high streets. A small business with a rateable value of less than £15,000 on a Scottish high street will continue to pay no rates for the entirety of next year, irrespective of what sector they are in, through the Small Business Bonus Scheme. A new build in one of our towns will pay no rates for the first 12 months after occupation through the Business Growth Accelerator. Our competitive rates reliefs are directly seeking to revitalise our high streets. On income tax, this government's priority has been to make the tax system fairer and more progressive, and to protect low and middle income taxpayers. With increases in the cost of living and rising fuel prices likely to impact lower income families the most, I believe that these principles are more important than ever. I can therefore confirm that income tax rates next year will remain unchanged. The starter and the basic rate bands will increase in line with inflation, and the higher and top rates will remain frozen at their current levels. Our progressive income tax policy means the majority of Scottish taxpayers will continue to pay less income tax than if they lived elsewhere in the UK, while those who earn more will pay more. It maintains spending power in households who need our support the most, yet also raises crucial revenues for our public services from those who can most afford it. On land and buildings transaction tax, we will maintain both residential and non-residential rates and bans at their current levels next year, and will shortly launch a call for evidence and views on changing the additional dwelling supplement. On Scottish landfill tax, we'll increase both the standard and lower rates of tax from the 1st of April to maintain consistency across the UK and support our ambitions for a more circular economy. In sum, with our devolved tax policies, we're delivering a more progressive approach to tax whilst also supporting recovery. And we're generating the revenues we need to invest in our NHS recovery plan, in our new National Care Service, a real terms budget protection for our police to keep us safe, and, of course, the doubling of the game-changing Scottish Child Payment to £20. The continued threat posed by COVID will remain the primary focus of the Government in the immediate term, not least in the face of the risk of further variants. Today I can set out our plans to provide increased funding to respond to the pressures created by the pandemic and ensure that everyone can get the care they need in a time, in a place and in a way that suits them. We're doing that despite the absence of COVID consequentials from the UK Government, which means we must absorb these additional COVID costs within our overall budget. In total, this budget provides record funding of £18 billion for health and social care, not only to address the immediate pressures across the NHS, but also to deliver the first step to ensure frontline funding, which directly supports patient services, increases by at least £2.5 billion by 2026-27. As we set out in our manifesto, we're delivering on our commitment to pass on all health and social care consequentials in full, with additional spend in excess of £1 billion in health and social care. Members will be aware of the staffing difficulties being experienced in the care service, with Brexit and the ending of freedom of movement once again a major factor. The transfer to local government for social care includes an additional £200 million, which will deliver the £10.50 minimum wage for all adult social care staff in commissioned services and support the recruitment and retention of care staff that are so vital to the health and care system as we begin the process of creating a new national care service over the course of this Parliament. The overall package provides £1.2 billion for mental health, taking forward our commitment to ensure direct mental health funding increases by 25% and that 10% of all frontline NHS spend goes to mental health by the end of this Parliament. We also reaffirm our commitment to keep the promise, which will see the establishment of an initial £50 million whole family wellbeing fund to provide person-centred, holistic support for children and their families. That funding will build during this session as capacity and capability for transformational change builds in the sector. The budget also deepens our partnership with local government. It delivers a settlement for local government that recognises the leadership role that councils play in their communities and their part in delivering a national recovery. It provides increased resources for social care and education, ensuring the continued delivery of vital local services across Scotland, while working to increase the fiscal autonomy and power of local government and put more say over how local budgets are raised in local hands. That includes record increased investment in teacher recruitment, supporting the recruitment of at least 3,500 teachers and 500 classroom assistants over this Parliament. Presiding officer, my investment plans for public services and action across portfolios are directed by three priority themes: tackling inequalities, supporting Scotland's economy and ending Scotland's contribution to climate change. And so the budget backs our national mission to tackle child poverty and to make Scotland truly a land of opportunity for everybody. The most immediate and direct way to tackle poverty is by putting more money into the pockets of people who need it most, ensuring a decent standard of living, particularly for children. This budget invests in increasing family incomes, driving down the cost of living. It provides £200 million for the Scottish Attainment Challenge, the next instalment of our commitment to provide £1 billion over this Parliament to tackle the poverty-related attainment gap. Over £4 billion across social security and welfare payments, providing vital support for low-income families, carers and disabled people, including £1.95 billion to start delivery of the adult disability payment next year. £41 million for the Scottish Welfare Fund, helping people in times of crisis. £80.2 million in discretionary housing payments. £110 million to provide free bus travel for young people from January, putting more money in their pockets and encouraging more use of public transport. It includes over £72 million for the continued expansion of free school meals, providing lunches for all children in P1 to 5 and special schools, and supporting the infrastructure required to roll out lunches to all primary children. It includes £544 million to deliver free funded early learning and childcare for 3- and 4-year-olds and 2-year-olds from lower income households, while taking forward work to expand that to 1-year-olds from low income households within this Parliament. And, Presiding Officer, £831 million for affordable housing, progressing our commitment to deliver 110,000 affordable, energy-efficient homes across the next decade, leveraging private sector investment and supporting employment in the construction sector. Presiding Officer, there is no question but that these measures will make a big difference. But we can and must do more. I know that there's consensus in this Parliament for greater action to tackle child poverty. And it's right that government stretches every sinew to do so. And that means we have to make hard choices elsewhere in the budget where necessary. We do so in order to fund the most ambitious anti-poverty measures anywhere in the UK, and to respond to the UK Government's decision to scrap the £20 uplift to universal credit. This budget delivers not just on the pledge in the programme for government to double the Scottish Child payment to £20 per week, but, as the First Minister announced last week, we will bring forward that commitment to April 2022. Presiding Officer, that is nearly £200 million in next year's budget going directly to lift children across Scotland out of poverty. Presiding Officer, I know that when our economy is prospering, there's more public revenue to reinvest. So we cannot talk about public services without ensuring that we are supporting businesses to recover. And this budget invests in Scotland's ambition of being a well-being economy, an economy that enables successful and profitable business activity, entrepreneurship and innovation, but is also environmentally sustainable and supports all parts of Scotland to thrive. We know that the biggest challenges facing businesses right now are labour shortages, rising costs and inflationary pressures. Our budget seeks to respond to each of these, to invest in skills and employability, to make catalytic investments which regenerate areas and boost trade and keep costs low. That will be a long-term process, and I'll shortly publish the Government's National Strategy for Economic Transformation to provide the vision and the leadership for the longer term. But it's a process that also starts now with this budget. Because today's budget provides over £205 million in capitalisation for the Scottish National Investment Bank, helping it deliver against its missions of supporting Scotland's transition to net zero, building communities and promoting equality and harnessing innovation. Scotland's geographical diversity is one of our great economic strengths. I can confirm investment of £51 million in rural services and islands, including activities linked to the National Islands Plan and introducing a new Islands Bond Fund. There are few challenges as acute as labour shortages, and so we will invest over £225 million in Skills Development Scotland to support a range of national training interventions. The budget allocates nearly £2 billion to Scotland's universities and colleges, delivering high-quality education and training. More generally, I'm providing more than £370 million to support our enterprise agencies and nearly £50 million to Visit Scotland to strengthen key sectors like tourism, to promote innovation and achieve sustained success in new and emerging markets. These actions, taken together with a package of non-domestic rate measures, provides a strong platform in this budget for Scotland's economy now and long into the future to thrive and prosper. Presiding Officer, I turn now to the climate crisis, which is also an enormous economic opportunity for Scotland. Our hosting of COP26 showcased what we're already doing in Scotland and the depth of commitment that exists to go further. I've worked closely with colleagues in the Scottish Green Party to shape those commitments, and I welcome their support and their constructive challenge. Through this budget, we will lay the groundwork to protect and restore our natural environment, to decarbonise our homes, our industries and transport, and to position ourselves as a global leader in renewable energy and in green and digital tech. Meeting our ambitious emissions reduction targets will require transformational activity across all sectors of the economy and across society. It's not an easy task, but we are up for the challenge. The just transition to net zero needs investment now. And today's budget sets out almost £2 billion of low-carbon capital investment in Scotland's public infrastructure, supporting the decarbonisation of our homes and buildings, our transport and industry. We'll also continue to work with the private sector to mobilise investment behind the low-carbon transition. The budget will lay the groundwork to secure a green recovery and follow through on our commitment to implement the recommendations of the Just Transition Commission across this Parliament. And so today, I can confirm the first £20 million of our 10-year £500 million Just Transition Fund for the North East and Moray, £336 million for energy efficiency and low-carbon and renewable heat, cutting emissions, making homes warmer, tackling fuel poverty and creating jobs across Scotland, including £60 million for large-scale heat decarbonisation projects. £53 million across a range of energy transition and industrial decarbonisation projects, which in turn include £20 million for energy transition fund projects in the North East. £23.5 million for our Green Jobs Fund, helping businesses create green employment through investment. And a record investment of £150 million in infrastructure to make walking, wheeling and cycling safer. £1.4 billion to maintain and improve and decarbonise Scotland's rail network. £43 million to drive forward Scotland's circular economy. £53 million to restore Scotland's precious natural environment, including our internationally important peatlands, addressing the twin crises of climate change and nature loss. £25 million this year to start work on transforming farming and food production in Scotland to be world-leading in sustainable and regenerative agriculture, and a further £69.5 million to be invested in woodland creation and sustainable management of Scotland's woodlands, enabling an increase of our woodland creation target to 15,000 hectares. Climate change requires global action, driven by local and national commitments to ensure we deliver the changes needed. And today's budget demonstrates that that commitment exists here. Let no one be in any doubt, this government, working in partnership with the Scottish Greens, is absolutely committed to meeting our statutory climate change targets and delivering the net zero society we not only want, but need to see. Presiding Officer, I want to lastly turn to the issue of pay. The principle of fair work is a cornerstone of this government's economic approach, and I have placed that principle at the centre of my decisions about public sector pay. I recognise the challenges presented by inflation and rising living costs, and also the huge effort that the public sector has made in responding to the pandemic. Our pay policy for next year therefore focuses on those on low incomes, continuing our progressive approach and guaranteeing an inflationary uplift of at least £775 to those earning up to £25,000, £700 to those earning between £25,000 and £40,000, and £500 to those earning above £40,000. In October, the Government announced an uplift in pay for social care workers to £10, 2 pence per hour. Today, Presiding Officer, I can announce a minimum wage floor of £10.50 per hour across all bodies covered by the pay policy, with specific funding to apply this for adult social care staff. Targeted support for many of our lowest paid staff across the public sector is hugely important, and this budget delivers that. Presiding Officer, as I come to a close, today's budget is a budget of choices. And we have chosen to tackle child poverty, to invest in the transition to net zero, and to boost economic prosperity. It delivers on our manifesto promises: more teachers, more funding for our police, and record investment in our health and social care service, as we stand united against the impacts of COVID-19. It's a budget for households facing a cost of living crisis, targeting resources at low-income families and making bold choices to address the devastating impact of child poverty. It's a budget for our businesses and our workers, with further financial support for enterprises now and a clear plan to achieve longer-term prosperity. And it's a budget for a net zero future that once again shows Scotland leading from the front in the defining mission of our generation. And, Presiding Officer, I commend this budget to Parliament and to the people of Scotland.
Thank you. The Cabinet Secretary will now take questions on the issues raised in her statement. I intend to allow around 60 minutes for questions, after which we'll move on to the next item of business. And I'd be grateful if members who wish to ask a question were to press their request to speak buttons now. And I call Liz Smith.
Thank you. And Cabinet Secretary, can I say thank you for advance sight of your statement, and Labour, thank you for advance sight of your questions. Now, the Cabinet Secretary is a fair-minded person, but I have to say I'm absolutely astonished that for this budget she's not been able to at least acknowledge that she has at her disposal record block grant funding from Rishi Sunak and the UK Government, up by 10.6% and proving the benefits of Scotland being part of a strong United Kingdom, needed now more than ever as we battle our way out of the prolonged pandemic. The Scottish Conservatives were very clear that the focus of this budget should be twofold: on supporting our public services coming out of COVID-19 and accelerating our economic recovery. These two goals are not separate, each relies on the other, and achieved together they will secure the well-being of Scottish jobs, Scottish companies and Scottish families into the future. And in this respect, can we welcome the doubling of the child payment, which is something that we had called for. Presiding Officer, we had called for it. I can keep a straight face. Presiding Officer, we understand that budgets are about choices. And the lead-up to today's statement, we made choices that show it is possible to balance support for public services and the move to net zero with the protection of jobs and stimulating economic growth. Such is that concern, and on the back of what businesses were telling us, we wanted the SNP to extend 75% rates relief to customer-facing businesses in the next financial year, a measure which would be worth £631 million to businesses. And so we think businesses will be disappointed by today's budget statement. And can I ask why there is no commitment to a clear programme for long-awaited structural reforms to the Scottish economy, most especially to the reform of non-domestic rates as called for by Liz Cameron and the Scottish Chambers of Commerce, as well as greater investment in skills and the digital infrastructure, which has been called by our business organisations and by our colleges and universities, which all will play a leading role in securing Scotland's future economic success. Secondly, we wanted to ensure that money goes to frontline health services and the care sector, where it is very clear that there are significant resource issues. Scotland is set to receive £2.1 billion in healthcare consequentials, and while there is £1.2 1.2 billion of consequentials coming to local government, there is clearly a real-term cut to local government in this budget. So perhaps the Cabinet Secretary could explain what this choice means, and also if she could explain that the money that does go to local government, whether these local authorities will have the autonomy to spend that money as they choose. Thirdly, we will reject any attempt by the SNP, whether now or in later budgets, to backtrack on its £2.2 billion of commitments to upgrade the road network, including the dualling of the A9 and A96, which are not only important for connectivity and economic growth, but provide a much-needed lifeline for our rural communities, many of which have suffered disproportionately during the pandemic. So after all the confusion that we've seen in recent weeks and the absence of clarity in today's statement, can the Cabinet Secretary tell us exactly when these two upgrades will be completed? Presiding Officer, we will measure all the announcements in this budget against the essential test of whether they will assist the efforts to project jobs and families and safeguard our economy. The budget process is a chance for the Scottish Government to put aside party political priorities and act in the national interest. That will be the test of whether this budget delivers for Scotland.
Cabinet Secretary.
Thanks, Presiding Officer, and thanks to Liz Smith for those questions. But let's start with the block grant funding, because you can't, by any calculations, come to any other conclusion but that next year's budget is a reduction on this year's budget. Why? Because the Tories have wished COVID away. They have stripped out all COVID consequentials. That's funding to tackle the impact of COVID on our health service, on our justice system, on our transport system. We know, and the people of Scotland know, that COVID continues to have an impact. So to wish away and strip out all COVID consequentials completely disregards the risks that our public services and our people are facing right now. On the specific asks that Liz Smith has identified, I'll start with rates relief. I mean, let's remember that retail, hospitality and leisure businesses under a Conservative government started paying rates last July. In Scotland, they are still not paying rates. So in terms of dealing with the ongoing pressures that businesses face, there is a far bigger cushion here in Scotland. And we know what businesses are raising as primary concerns with us. Labour market shortages, the rising costs of materials, as well as the impact of inflation. Many of those issues have been inflicted by a Tory government itself. In terms of the structural reform to non-domestic rates, I mean, we have just seen the Chancellor announce his big reforms to the non-domestic rate systems. Interestingly, what he did was take our best ideas and reform the non-domestic rate system in England according to measures that were already in place in Scotland. But I suppose my last point to the Conservatives is, if you want to deliver the many choices and the many options that you have set out today, you will need to tell the Parliament how you're going to do that. What will you cut? Or what taxes will you hike? Because at the end of the day, if we are to deliver the health and social care funding, if we are to protect businesses with the pressures that they face, and most importantly, if we are to absorb all the COVID costs within our budget because there is no additional COVID funding, then there is very stark choices facing this Parliament. And I think every party, including the Tories, need to be clear what they'll cut or what tax rates will rise.
Paul Daniel Johnson.
Thank you. Perhaps I should begin in terms of advance sight of the statement. Rather than saying thank you, is say you're welcome. But the real question the people of Scotland are wondering is not just when will we get back to normal, but when will we move beyond the crisis. But unfortunately, this budget fails to answer that question. Challenging times require bold action. But rather than rising to this challenge, this budget is just more managed decline under the SNP. Now, there are, of course, things we welcome in the budget. It is right the NHS gets the bulk of new funding. But we know there are more people stuck in hospital because we can't recruit enough care workers to look after them than there are people in hospital with COVID. That's why care workers deserve a fair pay increase to £15 now, not a meagre, barely 50p pay rise. That is an insult to those hard-working workers. And high streets and local shops are the heart of our communities, but they face a bleak new year. With to-let boards springing up across Scotland, it is not enough to write off retail and manage decline and just resetting that cliff edge 3 months into the summer. And in terms of action on child poverty, that will always be welcome. But the government's own targets demand not just doubling the child payment, but increasing it to £40 by April 2023. And as we consider the prospect of new restrictions, every parent is wondering whether this winter will bring more disruption to their schooling. Recovery means implementing the same ventilation systems and standards we demand in our offices, in our children's classrooms, not just asking for them to open the window and hope for the best. Over recent weeks, the Cabinet Secretary, and indeed has repeated today, she's attempted to dampen expectations, claiming she has no money. But this is not true. The block grant this year will increase by £3.9 billion, 7.7% in real terms. That is the largest increase in the block grant since 2001. So the Cabinet Secretary has choices to use these funds to be bold, to deliver recovery, or continue SNP-managed decline. And Scottish Labour make no apologies for pushing her to be bold, to make recovery real, not just a political posture or a name check. So let me ask the Cabinet Secretary, how is she going to entice more people into social care work when she's only offering 48p increase on their wages, just 0.6% above inflation? And how many retail businesses does she think will go to the wall 3 months after the new financial year begins? And indeed, how many businesses pay rates at all if their rateable value is below £15,000? And finally, how far short of the government's own child poverty targets will they be at the end of the next financial year?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, it's really unfortunate to hear the Labour Party parroting the Conservatives' press release in terms of the funding available. The Conservatives will parrot that line. Labour should get behind the headlines and recognise the fact that we have got to absorb all the COVID costs within our budget. But one of the advantages in seeing what Labour's asks were ahead of time was that I did some calculations, and their overall asks, we calculate, comes to approximately £3 billion of additional funding. Assuming that the Labour Party don't want us to cut anything within the budget that's been published, can I check if they want every taxpayer in Scotland to be paying £1,000 more per year in order to deliver that? But coming on to the specifics, I do think that we should be paying our carers more. That's why we have confirmed a wage floor today of £10.50 per hour. That is higher than the national minimum wage, it's higher than the real living wage, and we're fully funding local government to do that. That uplift is taking pay for social care workers significantly higher than the national living wage of £8.91, which applies to many social care workers elsewhere in the UK, including in Wales under the Labour Party. It's also higher than the £10 per hour that the UK Labour Party are calling for carers to be paid in England. Now, two other points, if I might, Presiding Officer, on high streets and local shops. This is where we agree that we do need to invest in our high streets and ensure that local enterprises can thrive. That's why we have taken 110,000 small businesses out of rates altogether. But the member will know, as well as I do, that it's more than rates that will invest in our high streets and ensure that our local towns are thriving. My last point, because Labour has previously called for £20 per week per child with the Scottish Child Payment. As soon as we deliver, they obviously increase that figure. But I do have a question for them, and that is whether or not they will vote in this budget to put £20 per week in for every child in Scotland that is eligible, or will they vote at the end of the day against an additional £20 per week per child?
I call Alex Cole-Hamilton.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. The Scottish Liberal Democrats will always... Presiding Officer seems to be a disruption here.
Deputy First Minister, I thank you for your contribution, but I will chair this meeting of Parliament and we will hear Mr Cole-Hamilton.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer, if I may. The Scottish Liberal Democrats will always engage constructively in negotiations around the Scottish budget, particularly in a year when the budget carries such importance. We did last year. It's why, with an additional £120 million afforded to mental ill health, we backed the Scottish Government's budget before the election. But we're going to need to do a lot more on mental ill health, given the hidden pandemic of mental ill health that has been caused by COVID-19. It is a dismay to our party, Presiding Officer, that we are witnessing in this budget a real terms pay cut to teachers, nurses and many thousands of public sector workers in the face also of a rise to national insurance contributions and rising costs of living. I also agree with Labour that the derisory pay increase offered to social care staff is not going to be the transformational injection that we need to make this a profession of choice and attract people into the profession. Presiding Officer, the Cabinet Secretary for Finance describes this as a budget of choices. Yet it is concerning that she has, on page 103, chosen to put preparations before another independence referendum, yet nowhere in the pages of the budget document does she make reference to the 100,000 people in Scotland currently suffering from long COVID. It is an event that has been characterised as perhaps being the biggest mass disabling event since the First World War, and yet those 100,000 Scots are nowhere in the pages of this document. So can I ask the Cabinet Secretary for Finance, is this an oversight? If it is, can we meet together to discuss how best we can extend long COVID care? And if it isn't an oversight, what does she have to do to those many tens of thousands of Scots suffering at home from this debilitating condition?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, on the contrary, I think the pay policy that we've set out today is progressive, it's fair, and it focuses our efforts on the lowest paid. And can I remind the member again that we did that last year without any consequential funding because the UK Government froze the majority of salaries under the public sector pay policy. And again, this year, we're still slightly in the dark about what they're going to do. So despite that, we have moved ahead to ensure that our public sector pay policy is affordable and it is fair. In terms of long COVID, he'll know that we've published our approach paper to set out 16 commitments to improve care and support for people with long COVID in Scotland, backed by £10 million long COVID support fund. And in terms of the document with record spending on health and social care, we will ensure that as part of that £18 billion, that there is a focus on people who are suffering from long COVID, which is a hugely important issue. I suppose I'd make my last point to the Lib Dems, same point I've made to other parties, which is I've allocated every penny on the face of the budget. Right. I have done that having absorbed all the ongoing COVID costs within the reducing budget compared with last year. And therefore, if we are going to increase any budget line, my question is how? Where does it come from and how do we fund it? Because at the moment, every penny is accounted for.
I call Kenneth Gibson to be followed by Murdo Fraser. Kenneth Gibson to be followed by Murdo Fraser.
Presiding Officer, I thank the Cabinet Secretary for bringing forward our budget by a week to allow the Finance and Public Administration Committee to undertake greater scrutiny, and I appreciate her difficulties given the resources available to her will decline further in the 2 years following this budget. Given fiscal constraints, and as this Parliament has no powers over excise and fuel duty, inheritance tax, VAT, national insurance, etc., all of which are available to the UK Government but which the opposition seek to continue denying us, how much extra would each Scottish taxpayer have to fund Tory, Lib Dem and Labour spending demands? Not easy to answer, I appreciate, given that many are completely uncosted.
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I thank the member for that question. It is, of course, for opposition parties to explain the detail of their policy proposals, precisely what they want to fund and how it would be funded. I've shared my estimation of the cost of the requests of the Labour Party, which I reckon to be in the range of £3 billion, and as a general illustration, that would cost every Scottish income taxpayer around £1,000 a year on average, if funded through income tax rates alone. But we also know that households and businesses across Scotland are facing the challenges of an increase in the cost of living, rising energy costs, rising inflation and also a rising tax burden. So at the end of the day, having allocated every penny on the face of the budget, it is for others to determine how additional asks are funded.
Call Murdo Fraser, to be followed by Michelle Thompson.
Thank you. Table 5.01 on page 39 of the budget document shows local government spending, excluding COVID funding, increasing only marginally from £11.124 billion to £11.145 billion. That represents a substantial real terms cut. Doesn't this make it inevitable that we will see substantial council tax increases for hard-pressed households as a result of this Finance Secretary's choices?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, in terms of the local government finance settlement, it delivers real terms growth to the settlement. It protects the core budget in cash terms, and it also ensures that local government are getting a fair share of the health and social care consequentials, which is something that they have long called for. Now, that additional £200 million will directly support investment in health and social care, knowing as we do how important it is to invest in the preventative side of health and social care so as to reduce the pressure in acute services.
I call Michelle Thompson, to be followed by Jackie Bailey.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I congratulate the Cabinet Secretary on such an outstanding budget statement, given the severe challenges created by a frankly incompetent UK government. Now, the Cabinet Secretary rightly puts economic recovery at the heart of her budget, and as the first ever female to hold her post, I want to ask her about issues of concern for many women in business. What can be done to ensure there is increased granularity of the economic impact on women across government, both of COVID and Brexit and so on? And what can be done to ensure that women are not discriminated against in seeking business funding for start-up companies?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, it's an excellent question, and one of the pieces of work that we are doing right now, particularly after the COVID grants, drew attention to the fact that fewer women had received some of those business support grants, is to use the Women's Business Centre, which will be established over the course of this Parliament, and work with the enterprise agencies to ensure that funding is being shared equally, and also to ensure that women have an equal opportunity to participate in not just the labour market, but in growing, in founding businesses. And we're working collaboratively with a number of organisations, including Women's Enterprise Scotland, to achieve a better sort of equal playing field when it comes to both participation and pay.
Jackie Bailey, to be followed by John Mason.
There is a huge and growing workforce crisis in social care because of endemic low pay, and that has a direct impact on the crisis currently in the NHS. In that context, an increase of 48 pence is derisory for the work that social care workers do. These were the people on the front line of the pandemic. These were the people caring for our loved ones. These were the people who we clapped for every Thursday evening. So why have the SNP and the Greens, who put this in their manifesto, not listened to the trade unions, the social care employers and those who receive care, that there needs to be an uplift immediately of £12 per hour from next year? This is the second budget in a row that we have asked for this. It's costed, it's affordable without raising a single penny in income tax. Or is the truth that the SNP and the Greens simply do not believe that social care workers are worth it?
Cabinet Secretary.
Jackie Bailey will know that it has been costed. And what the Labour Party have been calling for is £15 per hour, which will cost £1.8 billion. So we have chosen, over the course of this year, to increase the social care pay to £10, 2 pence per hour as a priority, and now increase it to £10.50 per hour. That is 48 pence per hour per week towards social care workers. It is a priority that we have. It is higher than the national minimum wage. It is higher than the real living wage, because we believe in the importance of our carers, not just as part of ensuring that the health service can continue with the challenges it faces, but also to ensure that we recognise and value the work that our social care workers do.
John Mason, to be followed by Ross Greer.
Thank you. I think the Cabinet Secretary knows that the Finance Committee has been keen that we move to more preventative spending. So if we take something like health and social care, can she say anything about how much of the budget will be considered preventative spending and if there's been any change over recent years?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, the budget does underpin our commitment to shift the balance of spend towards mental health, to primary, social and community care, and it delivers over 50% of frontline spend directed towards community health services and progresses our commitment to increase primary care funding by 25% over this Parliament. And those are examples of where we have tried to increase preventative spending so as to reduce pressure in acute areas. £1.6 billion investment in social care and integration lays the groundwork for a national care service, and there are other examples that I can point to where we have tried to shift the balance of spend.
Ross Greer, to be followed by Christine Graham.
Thank you. This budget is historic for a number of reasons, including the fact that it's the first to be co-produced by a Green Party anywhere in the UK. Despite the challenges of the pandemic, inflation and cuts from Westminster's Tory government, it prioritises tackling child poverty and the climate emergency. For example, there's record investment in making homes and buildings warmer and easier to heat, lifting families out of fuel poverty and reducing emissions. And it will fund the first full year of free bus travel for everyone under 22. So can I ask the Cabinet Secretary if she can confirm how many young people will benefit from this transformational policy?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, over 930,000 children and young people will be eligible for free bus travel when the Young Persons Free Bus Scheme is introduced.
Thank you. I call Christine Graham to be followed by Rachel Hamilton.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I too refer to the £200 million additional funding directly to local government to fund the increase to £10.50 per hour as a minimum to adult social care staff. That, for me, is to be welcome. But I think to increase recruitment, we have to look beyond that to there being career progression for those in the care sector. Can I ask if that will form part of the consideration of the National Care Service?
Cabinet Secretary.
It will certainly form part of the consideration of the National Care Service, but we're not waiting until the National Care Service to start that work right now. And I've talked about the £200 million directly for pay, but there are other initiatives that we are directly funding to increase capacity, for example, £25 million for social work capacity, £50 million of investment to progress fair work, £40 million of investment in multidisciplinary teams, and £5 million as well to support the right to respite for unpaid carers. So it's a much bigger picture of our investment in social care over and above our commitments to increase adult social care staffing.
Call Rachel Hamilton to be followed by Neil Gray.
Thank you. Presiding Officer, this is not a green budget for farmers. It's not a net zero budget for the future of agricultural transformation. The SNP Green coalition of cuts have slashed the Agricultural Transformation Fund from £45 million to £25 million per annum. Cuts that will affect reducing emission targets, agricultural productivity and transforming food and farming production. Cabinet Secretary, why are you cutting this vital agri-environmental funding for hard-working farmers who are part of the solution to net zero?
Well, I think farmers right now are actually asking what kind of confirmation and commitment they have to replacement of EU funding for the agricultural sector here in Scotland. What we have set out when it comes to investment in farming and in agriculture more generally is continued support, but also support to help farmers and crofters and those that work in the agriculture sector to transition to net zero. We know it's not going to be simple and straightforward and easy, and quite clearly there is investment in this budget to support farmers to do that.
Call Neil Gray to be followed by Michael Mara.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I want to commend the Finance Secretary in what has been a
challenging budget for prioritising child poverty, our greatest area of preventative spend, and the way she is engaged on the issue. In particular, can she outline her estimate of the impact of the £200 million doubling of the Scottish Child Payment will have on child poverty in Scotland, and to what extent that will mitigate against the disgraceful cut of £20 per week to universal credit that has been made by the Tory UK Government?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, once rolled out in full to under-16s, around 400,000 children will be eligible for the Scottish Child Payment, and 40,000 are estimated to be lifted out of poverty in 2023-24. Now, I know that as a Finance Secretary, I frequently use figures like this, but yesterday I had the opportunity to meet some of the families who will directly benefit, and their children were there hearing about the impact that this will have to the challenges that they face. Means that these numbers, 400,000 children, are far more than just statistics.
Michael Mara, to be followed by Rona Mackay.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. There is nothing in this budget to keep schools safe and open. Nothing at all on vital ventilation. There's nothing in this budget to help when schools close. No action on those promised laptops, and nothing to make good the losses already suffered. This is badged as a budget for everyone, but it cuts 12% from the Scottish Attainment Challenge, meaning cuts to staff working with the poorest pupils. The 9 poorest communities will see that funding cut by 60% by the end of this Parliament. It isn't really for everyone, is it?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, on the contrary, can I make a point that somewhat agrees with the premise of Michael Mara's question, and that is that the ongoing impact of COVID, which is very real in our schools and in our education system, has had to be absorbed within our overall budget because there are no COVID consequentials for those issues. However, having said that, we have prioritised spending on our schools. We are making the biggest increase in funding to support teacher recruitment since 2007. We have funding in this budget of over £70 million for P4, P5 and special school lunches. There's £15 million in this budget towards providing a digital device to every school-aged child. So we are focused on ensuring that our teachers and our schools have the resources that they need within a very challenging budget.
Rona Mackay, to be followed by Douglas Lumsden.
This government has delivered nearly 106,000 affordable homes since 2007. Can the Cabinet Secretary outline how the 22-23 budget will support the new ambitious target to deliver a further 110,000 affordable homes by 2032?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, we have led the way in the delivery of affordable housing across the UK, with spending per head on affordable housing already 3 times higher than the UK Government. And as a result, in the last 4 years, we've delivered over 9 times more social rented properties per head of population than in England. And the budget increases the funding available for affordable housing by a further £174 million next year, so we're able to continue the important work we started in 2007 of ensuring that everyone in Scotland has a warm, safe and affordable place to live.
Douglas Lumsden, to be followed by Stuart McMillan.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. At the Finance Committee, we've been hearing the importance of spend in early intervention and prevention, and the Cabinet Secretary mentioned it earlier. Our local councils can make a huge difference when it comes to prevention, but the derisory uplift to the local government core budget is a slap in the face to those authorities who have done so much over the last year. When will the Scottish Government put its money where its mouth is and properly fund our local councils?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, as I said to Douglas Lumsden's colleague, this is a real terms growth to the settlement, and it does protect the core budget in cash terms. There is significant investment in education and social care within the local government finance settlement. But taking a step back, as I understand it, the Conservative asks for this budget are to ensure that health and social care money is passed on for health and social care needs. And that means that if you take out the fact that there's no COVID consequentials in this budget and the uplift is largely due to health and social care funding, where is the additional funding for our local government? We've gone as far as we possibly can when it comes to protecting local government in light of the important role that they play. But at the end of the day, it is a stark reflection on the nature of the settlement available to us to then pass on.
Stuart McMillan, to be followed by Pam Duncan-Glancy.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Scottish Government's continued focus on addressing inequalities in education is welcome, but can the Cabinet Secretary provide any further detail about how this budget will support the Scottish Government's work to help to close the poverty-related attainment gap, and outline what measures are included to tackle the costs of the school day for my constituents in Greenock and Inverclyde?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, we are absolutely committed to tackling the impact of poverty on educational experiences and attainment. And the budget includes £200 million for the Scottish Attainment Challenge, part of a commitment to provide £1 billion over the Parliament to tackle the poverty-related attainment gap. And that includes continued investment in pupil equity funding, reaching 97% of schools. And recognising the impact of both poverty and the pandemic on pupils across all of Scotland, it includes the distribution of over £43 million to all 32 local authorities.
Pam Duncan-Glancy, to be followed by Emma Roddick.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Scottish Government will be aware of analysis by the JRF and the Fraser of Allender Institute that makes clear that doubling the Scottish Child Payment and other measures set out in today's budget do not go far enough to tackle child poverty, and that without further action on social security, including raising the Scottish Child Payment to £40 by April 2023, it will miss the child poverty targets that this Parliament unanimously set before the pandemic, before any universal credit uplift was in place, and without caveat. Does the Scottish Government accept this analysis, and will it admit that it is on course to miss the interim 2023-24 child poverty target?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, in terms of the member's question, I think she's right to say that it needs to be a multifaceted approach. So the Scottish Child Payment in isolation will not, in and of itself, ensure that we meet the Scottish child poverty targets. We need to take a much rounder look at how to do that. That includes continued investment, for example, in employability schemes to help parents and ensure that they are paid the real living wage. It includes a reduction of the costs of the school day, including rolling out free school meals, including ensuring that we are supporting children, whether it's through the uniform grants or otherwise. So there is a much bigger picture here of the action that we are taking. But what I have made clear in my budget statement and in the budget is that tackling child poverty is one of this government's 3 top priorities, and we are absolutely determined to reach those targets, not because it's politically advantageous to meet targets, but because every one of those children in poverty is a blight on this country and requires all of us to step up to the plate to do something about it.
Emma Roddick, to be followed by Tess White.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm particularly happy to hear about planned investment in affordable housing, which the Cabinet Secretary and my Highlands and Islands colleague will know is absolutely vital. Can I ask her how this budget will address depopulation issues across the Highlands and Islands?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, that is an issue that's particularly close to my heart, and I'm delighted that Emma Roddick has raised that question. The budget does a number of things which I think tackles depopulation in the Highlands and Islands. It supports the delivery of Scotland's first population strategy to set out ambitious sets of actions to address the demographic challenges, but the strategy aligns with our commitments through the National Islands Plan, in particular to address population decline and ensure a balanced population across all of Scotland. And that work is supported by the Islands Programme, which is investing £30 million of infrastructure investment. But Emma Roddick raised a really important point, which is as part of our overall investment in affordable housing and education in local government, we need to make sure that we are giving our partners the tools and the resources they need to ensure that the Highlands and Islands are an attractive place to live, work and do business.
Tess White, to be followed by Stephanie Callaghan.
Cabinet Secretary, fact. The number of businesses in Scotland has dropped by almost 20,000 in just 1 year. That's a devastating blow. Does the Scottish Government accept that it needs to do much more to help businesses, and particularly SMEs, improve their digital capabilities, and also significantly expand the support provided for upskilling and reskilling, as the Federation of Small Businesses has called for?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, it's nice to agree, but yes, I do agree on the fact that we need to invest in digital capability in particular, and the member may be aware of our commitment to invest in the recommendations of the Logan Review, for example, in helping businesses to access digitalisation and to improve the tech capabilities of their business. And we have set out commitments of £100 million to invest, for example, through the Digital Boost scheme. I think to provide support to small businesses, which are the backbone of our economy and certainly the backbone of our villages and our towns, we do need to give them the resources they need and to understand the pressures that they face. And I think continuing, for example, the Small Business Bonus Scheme also reduces the costs so that they can reinvest in some of these capabilities. And in terms of upskilling, because I missed that part, yes, I do agree. So the National Transition Training Fund, for example, has tried to cater to specific requests and requirements within sectors rather than to be a blanket scheme so that it can be of better use, for example, to the tourism industry.
Stephanie Callaghan, to be followed by Mark Griffin.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Does the Cabinet Secretary agree that the UK Government must play its role in our transition to net zero and urgently reverse their illogical decision to overlook the Scottish carbon capture, utilisation and storage cluster for Track 1 status, which would support over 15,000 green jobs?
I'm not wholly convinced as to that question's relevance to this statement. Cabinet Secretary, if you want to reply in a sentence, very, very briefly.
I believe that as energy policy is reserved, we do need to see the UK Government investing in Scotland, and it's important that that is done alongside the investment that we are making through our budget.
I call Mark Griffin, to be followed by Emma Harper.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. In real terms, another £137 million is gone from local bin collections, fixing potholes, keeping libraries open and cutting grass. When will our towns and cities ever get the resources they need to recover and grow after the pandemic and after over a decade of SNP cuts to our communities?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, in terms of our investment in local government, I've set out already, but I'm happy to set out again that this is a real terms growth to the overall settlement and includes protection for the core budget in cash terms. I could go through the list of areas where we're investing in partnership with local government, particularly in health and social care, which is one of the biggest pressures facing local government, alongside education. But ultimately, the budget as it is, I've tried to push as far as I can to protect local government budgets, and that is what this budget delivers.
Emma Harper, to be followed by Jamie Halcrow-Johnston.
I just want to pick up on agriculture also. The Cabinet Secretary mentioned £25 million for sustainable and regenerative agriculture in her statement. Can the Cabinet Secretary provide further information as to how this will be allocated to help support farming and food production in Scotland so that it is world-leading in sustainability and a regenerative agricultural approach?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, over the next 3 years, the Scottish Government has committed £51 million to a national test programme that will enable our farmers and land managers to be better able to contribute to our climate targets and biodiversity goals. And the industry is already leading the way, and there are countless examples of regenerative practices already underway. Our commitment in this budget is to start that process, and as the member said, there is £25 million included to transform how farming and food production is supported in Scotland.
Jamie Halcrow-Johnston, to be followed by Bob Doris.
The Cabinet Secretary has spoken today about the need to invest to rebuild our economy, but as she will know, infrastructure issues across Scotland and particularly in the Highlands and Islands remain a barrier to growth. So given she didn't answer the question from my colleague Liz Smith, can she confirm the funding outlined in this draft budget will ensure that dualling programmes for the A9 and the A96 are back on track by the end of the budget period, and that the Scottish Government will deliver both dualling schemes in full as promised?
Cabinet Secretary.
Member will know that, perhaps like himself, I use that A9 at least twice a week, every week. So if anybody knows the importance of delivering on dualling, it's me. I can assure the member that there is no dilution of funding for the A9 in this budget. We have a budget earmarked in the 2022-2023 capital spending review to fund the A9 and the A96. And the budget allocation for the A9, if he's interested, will allow us to continue to progress with completion of the statutory processes, the procurement and the commencement of the construction of the Tomatin to Moy section, which is in his region but not quite in my constituency, and preparations for procurement of the remaining elements of the programme. So I hope that gives him and our joint constituents some reassurance.
Well done. Bob Doris, to be followed by Maggie Chapman.
Can I ask the Finance Secretary how this budget will support the introduction of new benefits in the next financial year, including the rollout of the adult disability payment and the new low-income winter heating assistance to hundreds of thousands of Scots?
Cabinet Secretary.
Social Security Scotland is already successfully delivering 11 benefits, 7 of which are brand new, and is getting ready to deliver several more. Low-income winter heating assistance will launch in winter 2022 and will provide support to around 400,000 low-income households with a £50 payment every year through an investment of around £21 million. Next year, we will launch the adult disability payment, our largest and most technically complex benefit to date, providing disabled people with a fundamentally different experience when applying for and receiving the support that they are entitled to.
Maggie Chapman, to be followed by Jenny Minto.
Thank you. With 1 in 4 children in Scotland in poverty, and with pressing concerns of pandemic fallout and the cruel actions of the UK Government, eradicating child poverty in Scotland is a moral obligation. That is why the Scottish Greens have been clear that the Scottish Child Payment should be doubled as soon as possible, and I am pleased that we are delivering this from April. It will make a real difference to those who are struggling most, alongside the commitments on paying and investment in a just transition. Can the Cabinet Secretary confirm how many children are eligible for the Scottish Child Payment uplift, and, importantly, how will the Government ensure that all those who are entitled to benefit?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, as the member said, once the Scottish Child Payment is hugely important, and once rolled out in full to under-16s, we estimate that around 400,000 children will be eligible for that payment, and 40,000 are estimated to be lifted out of poverty in 2023-24. The Scottish Child Payment is the most ambitious child poverty reduction measure in the UK, and of course we are working with other measures too in order to reach our targets on child poverty.
Jenny Minto, to be followed by Graham Simpson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Cabinet Secretary may be aware that I am holding a members' debate next week to highlight the importance of access to defibrillators in communities across Scotland. Access to defibrillators could play a significant role in improving outcomes in out-of-hospital cardiac arrests across Scotland. However, for some communities, the cost of purchasing defibrillators and ongoing materials continues to be a barrier. Whilst VAT on defibrillators continues to be a matter that is reserved to the United Kingdom Government, would the Cabinet Secretary agree that this would be one such area where the Scottish budget could go further if we had the full fiscal levers at our disposal to support community access to this life-saving equipment?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I commend the member for raising the important issue about defibrillators, and also the fact that she's having a debate next week. And perhaps it's an issue that we could raise, and I'd always be open to writing to my counterparts in the UK Government about some of the issues that she has identified.
Graham Simpson, to be followed by Eleanor Whittam.
Thank you. Can I press the Cabinet Secretary on roads again? There's a slight increase in the total budget for motorways and trunk roads, only slight, but the road improvement budget has been cut. So can she once again have a stab at this question? Will the A96 under this budget be fully dualled? Is there money for that?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, we have set out in this budget to continue investing in our roads, including the A9 and the A96. So in terms of the progress on the A96, the allocation of funding for the A96 will allow us to continue to take forward the review of the A96 in 2021-22, progress the preparation stages for dualling between Inverness and Nairn, along with a bypass of Nairn. We're committed to improving the A96 corridor to improve connectivity between the surrounding towns and address safety and environmental issues. There is funding in the budget for road improvement, which includes the A9 and the A96. I'm not sure how to be more blunt about the issue.
Thank you. I call Eleanor Whittam to be followed by Liam Kerr.
Can I refer members to my register of interests? I am a serving councillor at East Ayrshire. Local government has been at the forefront of our response to the pandemic, and it's welcome to see that despite a challenging budget situation devoid of any COVID consequentials, the Scottish Government is committing to a total funding package of over £12 billion for local government to support their work as we press forward with recovery. As we are all aware, local circumstances and spending priorities can vary significantly. So can the Cabinet Secretary say any more about the steps the Scottish Government is taking to maximise the freedom and flexibility which local authorities will have with their spending?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, alongside a funding package that provides an additional £853.9 million, or a 7.3% increase compared to this year, the budget delivers one of COSLA's key asks by providing complete flexibility to set a council tax rate that is appropriate to their local authority area. I think every year in which I have been involved with the budget and have negotiated and engaged with COSLA, this has been one of their primary asks. And I'm pleased to be able to write to COSLA today to agree not just to that flexibility, but also a number of other fiscal flexibilities, including a commitment to collaborative work on a fiscal framework for local government early next year.
Call Liam Kerr to be followed by Brian Whittle.
Officer. The budget suggests £20 million of the Just Transition Fund will be made available. What precisely is that £20 million allocated to? How did the Scottish Government arrive at this figure? And does the money come from the Scottish Government budget or loan capital from the Scottish National Investment Bank?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I don't quite follow what the member is saying about loan capital, but it comes from the Scottish Government's budget, it will be used to invest in initiatives in the North East. I know that a number of stakeholders who will know him as well as know me have been in touch to ask it to have a role in determining the best use for that funding. And so in terms of the funding overall, we've set out £500 million over 10 years, and it's our estimate that that funding will need to increase year on year. So, as it were, it's backloaded to ensure that the funding goes on the big catalytic projects that can most use it and help with that just transition. It's obviously not the only investment that's been made in the North East, and it builds on the £62 million for the Energy Transition Fund. And of course, that money would go even further if it was matched by the UK Government.
Yes. I call Brian Whittle to be followed by Sarah Boyack.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Cabinet Secretary, the Climate Change Committee report entitled Progress in Reducing Emissions in Scotland was published earlier this month, and it states that, and I quote, "We have not been able to establish whether and how proposals in the climate change plan add up to the required emissions reductions, and that the annual target during the 2020s will be very difficult to meet. Ambitious targets are all well and good, but mean little without a route map. So can I ask the Cabinet Secretary if the Scottish Government will deliver any finance and transparent policies that can deliver on the Scottish Government targets called for by the Climate Change Committee?"
Cabinet Secretary.
The answer is yes. The member will know that already we're obliged to update regular climate change plan updates in terms of that route map he calls for, because I agree with him that setting targets, and of course all parties in this Parliament were agreed on the targets, but setting the targets in and of themselves does not make it any easier to meet those targets, and it requires a plan which he will know we are obliged to update regularly. In terms of this budget delivers a step change in investment in our climate change ambitions, particularly when it comes to capital investment in, for example, decarbonisation and in transport. So those are areas that the Committee on Climate Change have identified as key priorities, and obviously the money that's been invested as part of this budget will deliver a step change that's required.
Sarah Boyack to be followed by Jamie Green.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Cabinet Secretary, you claim that you've given councils a fair settlement, but in Edinburgh and indeed across the Lothians, we see massive service pressures every day as a result of historic SNP underfunding and a growing population. In the last year, the IGB had to take £7 million out of reserves in Edinburgh to meet the immediate care crisis we face. But on an almost daily basis, constituents are getting in touch who are not getting the urgent care at home support they need now because of the shortage of care workers. Will the Cabinet Secretary accept that an extra 50 pence an hour for care workers does not begin to address rising prices and the huge housing cost increases we've seen in Edinburgh?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I think the member identifies a really important point, which is that one of the biggest pressures that councils are facing is on social care. And that's precisely why we have delivered a significant increase in the investment going to local government for social care as part of the health and social care consequentials, which has been an ask of COSLA for a number of years. And in terms of the second point, quite clearly, pay is a key part of retention and recruitment. And the £10.50 wage floor today will help to deliver that. I think we all have aspirations to ensure that our care workers are remunerated fairly. And what we've seen from this government is a significant increase over the course of this year to ensure that we not only recognise them rhetorically, but we value them in the choices that we have around our funding.
Jamie Green, to be followed by Stephen Kerr.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The budget published today states in black and white, everyone should have the right to access justice. Finance Secretary, I agree entirely, but the reality is there is a 5-year backlog of court cases to tackle. The Scottish Courts and Tribunal Services made a very specific and I think modest ask of £13 million to tackle it. Can I ask therefore why in the budget they've only been offered a third of that? And how on earth is such a massive shortfall going to help them deliver the true access to justice that victims of crime deserve?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, as politely as possible, can I suggest that that £13 million is in the budget? If I heard him correctly, we have significantly increased not only the justice portfolio, but also the Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service funding that's required in order to deal with that backlog. So there is a significant increase in the spending on justice to try and reduce that backlog. But can I make the same point that I've made already this afternoon, which is that those additional COVID costs, either the costs of mitigating COVID or tackling the impact of COVID, have to be absorbed within our budget. So the absence of COVID consequentials means that those costs have got to be absorbed. And I think it's really important that we recognise the ongoing pressures on our budget as a result of either mitigating COVID or dealing with the long-term impacts of COVID.
Stephen Kerr, to be followed by Katie Clark.
I have a straightforward yes or no question for the Cabinet Secretary. Scotland's employers want transparency about how the apprenticeship levy they pay is being spent in Scotland. Currently, they say it is far from transparent. And given the vital importance of apprenticeships to the future economy that we must build to achieve net zero, will the Cabinet Secretary listen to business and agree now to allow the greater transparency that business wants to see?
Yes.
Thank you. Katie Clark, to be followed by Miles Briggs.
The Scottish Government's budgets have increased over the last 10 years, but local governments' budgets have been repeatedly cut. North Ayrshire Council, for example, has had to make over £100 million in cuts. Given the £137 million real terms cut in this year's budget to councils' revenue grants, what does the Cabinet Secretary expect councils to do to continue to provide services and to deliver on her stated aim of reducing inequalities?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, two answers to that. The first is that we have protected the core budget in cash terms. The second point, however, in terms of the overall shape of the budget, the member will know, and I think she shares it, although she can correct me if that's not true, that most parties in this Parliament have a commitment to pass on health and social care consequentials. So having passed on health and social care consequentials, it means that there is a cut, or has been a cut, over the last decade of austerity to the rest of the Scottish Government budget. We have, as far as we possibly can, protected protected local government. But what I've tried to do in this budget is to recognise local government as a valued deliverer of the social care, and to ensure that some of that health and social care consequentials goes to local government. And the challenge there is that it needs to be used for social care.
I call Miles Briggs to be followed by Neil Bibby.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. NHS Lothian have warned MSPs across the Lothian region, SNP and Green members in this chamber as well, that they face a £100 million shortfall. Can I ask, have they raised this with the Cabinet Secretary? And if so, why did she deliver the lowest level of funding per head of population to Lothian yet again?
Cabinet Secretary.
I think that's a strange question, if I might say so, considering I've just announced record funding of £18 billion for health and social care in Scotland, including £12.4 billion of investment in our frontline health boards, including NHS Lothian. As the member will know, the Health Secretary raises with me on a very regular basis the challenges and the financial needs across our health and social care services, and that's why we have been able to deliver record funding for health and social care in this budget.
I call Neil Bibby, to be followed by Fiona Hislop.
The Finance Secretary has talked about an economic recovery and a green recovery, yet the green jobs budget is only £23.5 million. How many green jobs will it create?
Cabinet Secretary.
A lot more than if that funding wasn't there.
I call members. Thank you. I call Jeremy Balfour, to be followed by Claire Adamson. Apologies, coming thick and fast. Fiona Hislop.
Thank you, and I thank the Cabinet Secretary for her statement. Clearly, as she has just said, health and social care are key to the well-being, particularly of our constituents during what is still a very pressured pandemic. Can she explain the percentage of the overall budget that is still dedicated to health, and can she give further explanation as to how we can protect vital services, whether it's cancer, whether it's audiology in Lothians, with a very serious report published today, or indeed in other areas? And can we remind people that trying to have growth and attempts at net zero resolution and tackling inequality at the same time as all of this funding is still needed for our health and care budget is a stark reminder of the reality of living in a pandemic.
Cabinet Secretary.
I think the member raises a hugely important issue, which is to reflect on the needs right across the board right now within our health service as well as within other public services, and at the same time trying to support our households and businesses through one of the most challenging times on record, not just the impact of the pandemic, but also the impact of inflation. I've mentioned already that £18 billion is earmarked for health and social care as part of an overall budget that is just above £40 billion. So that in itself tells a story. And the rest of our budget is seeking to absorb the ongoing pressures from COVID, as well as to invest in growth and to invest in prosperity.
Jeremy Balfour, to be followed by Claire Adamson.
Thank you, President Officer. I'm sure the Cabinet Secretary will agree with me that the third sector has played an immense role in the last 2 years to support many people within our society. Will she now commit to a 3-year funding package rather than making charities apply year in, year out?
Cabinet Secretary.
Yes is the short answer to that question, because I agree with Jeremy Balfour that multi-year spending is hugely important. We have set out today our framework for the resource spending review, which will allow us to plan spending on a 3 to 4 year basis. And I intend to consult with a number of stakeholders, including the third sector and other public bodies, to ensure that the final resource spending review that's published gives them that reassurance of their multi-year position.
Claire Adamson, to be followed by Craig Hoy.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Cabinet Secretary, we find ourselves in a situation where we have an unclear path ahead in terms of the internal market and also the TCA, in terms of our voice as a Parliament and also the voice of the Government being heard in negotiations. How will the increase in the international and European relations budget ensure that Scotland's voice is heard and that we have a say in the future of Europe and the future of policy making that will affect our devolved responsibilities?
Well, I think it's really important, both from a...
Can I just be... Sorry, yes, I just want to remind members of the importance of questions and relevance to this afternoon's statement. Thank you. Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I mean, in terms of the budget itself, I think it's hugely important for our economic prosperity that we continue to keep trading links alive with countries around the world, not just countries within the European Union. And we have, of course, an ambitious export plan, which relies on those strong links. A lot of exporters in Scotland, particularly smaller exporters, have struggled as a result of the additional red tape due to Brexit. So keeping those links alive are hugely important. And that, of course, requires both the soft diplomacy of governments speaking to one another, as well as business-to-business links.
Craig Hoy, to be followed by Paul O'Kane.
Officer, the budget allocates £350 million to decarbonise the heating of 1 million homes and 50,000 non-domestic buildings by 2030. That's about £330 per building. I'm aware of a hotel which recently decarbonised, and it cost around £800,000. So does the Finance Secretary seriously propose that £330 per building, about the cost of a new Hoover, is enough to see that process through?
Cabinet Secretary.
I think the member raises quite an important point. I think the member raises an important point around the costs of decarbonisation. And one of the points that I'm very committed to is how we leverage private sector investment as part of our ambitions. I think all of us are clear that public sector investment in isolation will not be able to, on its own merits, get us to our net zero targets or to decarbonise at the rate that we need to. So we need to work collaboratively with the private sector to leverage in some of that funding to make sure that the public sector funding goes as far as possible. My impression is that most businesses want to do the right thing, and it's up to us to try and make it easier for them. Public sector funding will help, but it won't take us all the way.
Paul O'Kane, to be followed by Fulton McGregor.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Yesterday, many of us attended a protest outside this Parliament with our trade unions and listened to the testimony of workers who have been on the front line across the pandemic. In Scotland, many of them were care workers, and they will be interested in this debate today in terms of the pay rise that they are being given by this government. What does the Cabinet Secretary have to say to those workers after she has sat here and offered them a derisory 48p an hour pay rise? She was very fond, along with all other ministers and MSPs, in clapping care workers last year. Now they sit and they clap a 48p pay rise. That is unacceptable. And what does she have to say to those workers?
Well, this is the second pay rise in several months, because we value the important work that our carers do. And the fact that we are committing today to go beyond the national living wage, the real living wage, and ensure that carers are paid for their labours is the reason that we have set out this public sector wage floor of £10.50 per hour, which we are fully funding. So what would I say to them? I would say to them that we couldn't have got through the pandemic without you. We enormously value the work that you do, and we are matching our rhetoric with our commitment in this budget to invest in a £10.50 per hour wage increase.
And Fulton McGregor.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And can I put on record my thanks to the Cabinet Secretary for the groundbreaking child poverty measures that she's announced today. And I don't think there's anybody in this chamber should be voting against that come budget time. And on that basis, I want to ask about school uniforms. The Cabinet Secretary will be aware that I've done a bit of work pushing for these to be more affordable. I wonder if she could comment how that was taken into the decisions around the budget and what more local authorities will now be able to do, because there's loads of constituents that I've got that can't afford a £300 Hoover. They need to get their school uniforms.
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, it's a hugely important question, and the work that we are doing on school uniforms is part of a much wider piece of work to reduce the costs of the school day, and that includes significant investment in the expansion of free school meals. It includes the provision of milk. It includes assurance around funding to provide meals during school holidays, as well as helping families with some of the additional costs of school, whether that's around school trips or elements of the curriculum like art and home economics. So we are providing funding to local government to significantly reduce the costs of the school day as part of our mission to tackle child poverty.
Thank you. That concludes the ministerial statement on the Scottish Budget, and it's now time to move on to the next item of business. There are no questions to be put as a result of today's business. Therefore, that concludes decision time, and I close this meeting.
What distinguishes Broadcasting Scotland from a website or blog, apart from our brilliant programmes?
Hi there, I'm Gordon Ross.
Are the costs we face to enable us to produce those programmes. These costs are significant and ongoing. However, our facilities are able to do so much more if only we had the staff. In the last year, some of our supporters have cancelled their subscriptions. In one way, we would prefer it if it was because they didn't like us, rather than it being because of the financial pressures which we are all under because of COVID. The really positive outcome of our fundraiser is that at a time of economic challenge in Scotland, we will use your donations to create jobs and in a small way contribute to improving the Scottish economy. If you want us to be Scotland's independent broadcaster, able to provide an alternative mainstream television platform, then please support us.
Scotland is going to be an independent country.
Just imagine what we could do if we had even 1% of the BBC Scotland channel's budget. Imagine. And then please consider turning your imagination into reality. Please support us if you can afford it.